Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the swinging doors of an old Wild West saloon. Your boots kicking up sawdust on warped floorboards, your coat catching the dry scent of tobacco and spilled whiskey, and your stomach already curling slightly at the odd smell wafting from the back room where someone is boiling meat that definitely smells like it needed to be cooked 3 days ago. You ease up to the bar, which is more splinter than wood, and glance down at the tin plate sliding toward you, steaming with something brownish and definitely not vegan. Welcome to supper on the American frontier. If you were picturing steaks and tall glasses of frosty beer, you're about to get a gritty mouthful of disappointment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little journey travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're hungry, tired, dusty from the trail, and trying to ignore the bruised ridge on your shin from where your horse kicked you this morning. You push open the creaky doors of the nearest town saloon and pray. They serve something vaguely edible. Inside, the saloon isn't just a place to drink. It's one of the few social centers around, and it usually doubles as the town diner, card parlor, and fight club, often all at once. If you're lucky, the barkeep might be sober enough to remember there's a pot of food on the stove. If you're really lucky, that pot has something in it. There's no menu, of course. This isn't some fancy Eastern restaurant. What's for dinner depends entirely on what came off the last wagon, what didn't spoil, and what the cook felt like tossing into the pot. That's if there is a cook. More often than not, it's the bartender himself who's been slapping beans into bowls between dealing cards and breaking up fights. You might get a ladle of something called stew, though it could be anything from actual beef with potatoes and carrots to old squirrel meat flavored with onions and wishful thinking. Most of it has been boiling for hours, not to tenderize it, but because no one knows how long it's been sitting around. Historians still argue whether the house stew was a real recipe or just a euphemism for meat that had outlived its welcome. You take your first bite and instantly regret it. It's hot, salty, and carries the faint metallic tang of being cooked in a tin pot that's never been properly cleaned. Still, you chew slowly, letting your jaws do the work of digestion, because your stomach is already writing a formal complaint. Welcome to dinner. Alongside your stew, you might get a biscuit if they have flour, or more often a piece of hardtack, a type of rock masquerading as bread. It was originally meant for soldiers, but it ended up everywhere because it lasted forever and was cheaper than anything else that resembled actual food. To soften it, you'd soak it in coffee or stew broth, which only improved it if your idea of improved includes chewing wet cardboard. Speaking of coffee, it's already bubbling in a battered pot at the back. Don't expect anything like your Starbucks order, though. This stuff is more like burnt mud filtered through a sock. It's made from reused grounds boiled within an inch of their life, and you drink it not for flavor, but because water might kill you faster. At least it's hot and vaguely caffeinated, which is enough to get you through the next few miles or the next poker game. If the saloon's better supplied, maybe because it's near a railroad or a bigger town, you might find some pork belly sizzling on a skillet or beans that didn't come out of a sack older than your horse. Bacon was a frontier favorite because it could be salted to last months, and beans were everywhere, partly because they didn't spoil, and partly because you didn't need teeth to eat them. Add a chunk of lard and you've got dinner, calorically dense, not too complicated, and likely to sit in your stomach like a sandbag. And yet, for all the bad textures and questionable flavors, this meal was a lifesaver for men who'd been out herding cattle, building fences, or failing to pan gold in sun-scorched creeks. Protein, carbs, and fat. Frontier food wasn't pretty, but it got the job done. There's also the faint aroma of dried onions in the air, often added for flavor when available, but just as often for their mythical ability to ward off scurvy. You scoop up another spoonful and try not to think about the odd crunch that may or may not have been a pebble. Around you, cowboys eat without much conversation. Meals aren't for chatting, they're for fueling up before the next fight, card, game, or moonlit ride. Every once in a while, someone spits tobacco into a tin bucket with remarkable accuracy, and the clink echoes like a gunshot. Over in the corner, someone's passed out face down in a bowl, snoring into his beans. And somewhere in this chaos, a saloon girl balances a tray of drinks, dodging elbows and insults like it's just another Tuesday, which, technically, it is. If you glance toward the back room, you might see shelves lined with supplies, sacks of flour, jugs of molasses, tins of preserved fruit if they're fancy. These ingredients all came by wagon or train, and many of them cost far more out here than they would back east. Because of that, the stew you're eating is practically gourmet, even if it does taste like someone tried to boil a leather boot. Occasionally, you'll get a slice of something sweet, maybe an apple cobbler if the cook had time, or a chunk of dried fruit soaked in sugar water. It's not common, but it's memorable, mostly because it's the only thing that doesn't taste like salt. You finish your plate, wipe your mouth on your sleeve, because napkins aren't really a thing, and push the tin back toward the bartender, who gives you a grunt that probably means, "You're welcome." You can still hear the stew bubbling behind him, probably on its third day of life, and you quietly hope no one finds out what animal it originally came from. The piano player starts a slow tune, off-key, but at least it masks the sound of someone retching outside. That's just a normal night here. You lean back, hands resting on your full stomach, and try not to think about the fact that you may need to visit the outhouse later. In a way, you've survived the most treacherous part of the frontier, dinner. The dust, the heat, the horse, wrangling. None of it compares to the adventure of eating a meal that's equal parts hunger, hope, and hard-boiled horror. But you'll come back tomorrow because the stew may be terrifying, but it's yours. And besides, if you've eaten something worse, and you probably have, then this is just another notch on the belt of frontier life. So you tip your hat to the cook, whether he's awake or not, and head back toward your creaky little bunkhouse, the taste of salt and smoke still lingering on your tongue like the ghost of flavor. Welcome to supper in the Wild West, where you eat what you're given, chew like you mean it, and pray the beans were cooked all the way through. You wake up with your mouth dry, boots still on, and a vague memory of that stew sloshing around somewhere below your ribs like a regrettable storm. But the sun's up, the trail calls, and your belly's somehow hungry again, which is either a miracle or a threat, depending on what's cooking today. You stagger back into the saloon just in time for breakfast, which on the frontier is really just last night's dinner warmed over and renamed. The morning cook, who might be the same person from the night before, or maybe just whoever lost the coin toss, is already hunched over the stove, poking at something in a cast-iron pan with the attitude of a man who's seen too much and smelled worse. Breakfast out here is not eggs, Benedict or fresh croissants. It's a glorious, greasy mess designed to stuff your insides before you ride 12 hours under a brutal sun. Most likely, it's a fried mixture of beans, bacon fat, and whatever starch they can find, all shoved together into something that looks like regret and tastes like endurance. If you're lucky, there's a slab of salt pork sizzling away, its smell filling the saloon like a greasy incense, drawing in men from the street who follow the scent like moths to a lantern. You slide onto a bench and wait. There's no need to order, because there's only one option, and it's already on your plate before you can ask. The pork crackles when you cut it, tough but hot, and the beans are thick with yesterday's lard. A piece of hardtack stares up at you like it, remembers your dental history. Coffee, if you can call it that, comes black and bubbling, served in mismatched tin mugs with bits floating in it you try not to identify. This early, it's more of a medicine than a beverage. You sip slowly and let it scorch a path down your throat, hoping it wakes you up before it finishes melting your insides. For all the roughness, this is probably the best meal you'll get today, and you're grateful. Sort of. Frontier breakfasts weren't designed for pleasure. They were fuel. Protein, fat, a little sugar if you're in a good town. And while eggs existed, they were rare. Chickens were hard to keep alive in places where coyotes roamed and feed cost a fortune. So if you did get eggs, they were usually powdered or pickled into rubbery little mysteries. Milk was worse. Unless you were near a dairy ranch, it probably came canned, thick and sweet, closer to frosting than actual milk. You remember reading once that a cowboy's entire day could run on a breakfast like this, especially if it came with sourdough flapjacks, tough, chewy things made from batter left out overnight to ferment. That tangy taste wasn't fancy flavoring, it was survival. Yeast was expensive, so sourdough starter was reused endlessly, passed down like family heirlooms or guard dogs. Historians still argue whether sourdough made things taste better or just covered up the rot. Either way, you chew, slowly, unsure if the sourness is intentional or a red flag. Over in the corner, someone's frying potatoes, which feels like a miracle. Potatoes were hearty and stored well, but out here, even something simple like spuds felt like luxury. The smell is rich and comforting, and you momentarily forget that you're surrounded by splintered walls, sagging beams, and a guy throwing up out back. You stab a fried slice with your fork and enjoy the slight crunch. It's the closest thing to a proper breakfast you've had in weeks. And then there's molasses, thick, sticky, and poured over just about anything to hide the blandness. If you've got flapjacks, you drown them in it. If you've got cornmeal mush, you coat it like glue. Sometimes they just smear it on bread and call it dessert. Molasses was cheap, didn't spoil, and made everything taste a little like childhood. If you ignored the flies buzzing nearby, you wipe your mouth and look around. The saloon is quieter in the morning. Less yelling, more groaning. A few men are nursing hangovers with black coffee, while one is passed out with a spoon still in his hand. A dog slinks past under the table, hoping for scraps. Outside, the sun's already high, dust rising with every wagon that rolls by. You know you'll be out in it soon, so you sip your coffee and stretch your sore arms, grateful for a warm meal, even if it came with its own challenges. Breakfasts like this weren't just about food. They were about the moment, the quiet, before the chaos. A shared space where everyone, from gamblers to gold prospectors, got to be human for 10 minutes. It didn't matter if you'd struck it rich or lost everything in last night's poker hand. At the breakfast table, everyone chewed the same questionable bacon and stared into the same bitter coffee. There's something oddly comforting in that. Still, you can't ignore the realities. Food poisoning wasn't just a bad afternoon, it could kill you. Hygiene was a suggestion at best, and refrigeration was a pipe dream. Even ice, when it existed, had to be imported in giant blocks and stored underground. You once heard about a saloon owner who kept his butter in a well just to keep it from turning into soup, and butter was a treat. Most of the time, your flapjacks came dry unless someone managed to trade for it, steal it, or make it from a goat they swore was a cow. You finish your plate and wonder what's next. Maybe beans again by noon, maybe nothing. Food was feast, or famine, depending on trade routes, weather, and luck. And the saloon? It was the hub of it all. You've got a full stomach for now, and a day ahead of you that promises sweat, sunburn, and saddle rash. But for a brief moment, you feel full, caffeinated, and almost content. The dog comes back around and licks your plate, tail wagging. He probably knows what's for dinner better than you do. You push your chair back, tip your imaginary hat to the cook, who is now sitting on a stool peeling something that may or may not be a vegetable, and head outside into the dust. Another day, another meal survived, another round of mystery stew, waiting on the horizon. And you'll be back, because out here, the saloon isn't just a place to eat. It's your kitchen, your living room, your news source, and your refuge. Even if the eggs come powdered and the bacon smells vaguely of sadness, you step back into the saloon around midday, drawn more by the smell than by any real sense of hope. Lunch in the Wild West isn't marked by a bell or menu. It just happens when your stomach decides it can no longer function on caffeine and dust. The air inside is thicker now, heavier with heat, and the scent of overcooked meat, stale tobacco, and a hint of shoe leather, which may or may not be part of what's being served. You shuffle past a man passed out in a chair with a crust of something unidentifiable stuck in his beard and ease yourself back onto a bench, expecting very little and somehow still bracing for worse. There's no waiter, no printed list of specials, just a woman with sleeves rolled up to her elbows and a look that says, "Don't ask what it is, Just eat it. And you do, because you're not here for flavor. You're here to survive another afternoon. Today's offering is a thick stew, bubbling in a black pot so old it might qualify as a historical artifact. The stew is brown, just brown. No other adjectives apply. Within it, you find fragments of what could be carrots, chunks of potato, and strips of meat whose origin you refuse to contemplate too deeply. Beef? Maybe. Rabbit? Possibly. Something that used to moo or squeak, now reduced to softness, and a flavor profile best described as warm and vaguely meaty. The broth is salty enough to rehydrate a corpse and is thickened with flour and maybe a little regret. It sticks to the spoon and then to your ribs, which is what counts. You dip a crust of bread into it. The bread's been around a while, crust, hard as fence wood, and it softens just enough in the broth to become edible. That's the trick here. Nothing is fresh, but everything is functional. If it can be boiled, fried, or soaked in lard, it counts as lunch. Across the table, a man stirs his bowl with the concentration of a scientist. He sighs, lifts a spoonful, and mutters, "Could be worse." That's basically the Yelp review of the frontier. Lunches like this had to be cheap and filling. Cowboys didn't eat 3 square meals a day with balanced macronutrients. They needed food that kept them moving through dust storms and cattle drives. That's why beef stew was the staple, especially if you were near a herd. Some towns even had chuck wagons roll through and serve up big iron pots of the stuff to crowds of dust-caked travelers who didn't care whether it was properly seasoned, just that it was hot and didn't make them hallucinate. Salted meat was a key component, and when fresh meat ran out, salted beef or pork would take its place. You ever bite into a piece of salt pork that's been boiled just enough to make it chewable? It's like chewing on the preserved memory of a pig, salty, leathery, with a distant echo of what bacon might have once been. But it keeps you going. Alongside your bowl comes a single, sad pickle. It's been fished out of a jar so old, you can't tell if the brine is vinegar or melted glass. Still, pickles helped ward off scurvy, and in the absence of fresh fruit, even a limp cucumber was a gift from above. You munch it slowly, as if it's a rare delicacy. Food preservation was more than a convenience, it was a necessity. That's why so much frontier food was smoked, salted, pickled, or dried until its original flavor had evaporated entirely. Jerky was a favorite, a strip of meat dried to the consistency of roofing tile, full of protein and so tough it gave your jaw a full workout. Historians still argue whether jerky evolved for utility or punishment. Either way, every cowboy had some in his saddlebag. And sometimes, when stew meat was scarce, jerky got chopped up and tossed in to rehydrate in the pot, which is a generous word for what actually happens. It mostly just softens into a chewy mystery. Cornbread shows up too, especially in saloons run by Southern transplants. It's dense, dry, and always in danger of being more corn grit than bread, but when soaked in stew or slathered in lard, it becomes edible. Sort of. The version here crumbles easily, and you catch a whiff of burnt edges, but it's warm and spongy and doesn't shatter your teeth, which is a win. There's a moment of peace as you eat, the clatter of spoons and low murmurs the only sounds in the room. You take another sip of that coffee. Still bitter, still hot, still full of unidentifiable particles, and it washes down the salt and starch with a burn. There's something primal about this whole affair. You, a wooden spoon, a bowl of stew, and a dusty afternoon stretching out ahead of you. No frills, no choices, just a meal designed to hold your bones together. There's also a side of beans, because of course there is. Pinto, if you're lucky. Mushy, always. They've been cooking since morning, maybe since last week. Some towns threw bacon ends in with the beans for flavour. Others just let them ferment a bit and called it tangy. It fills the bowl, fills your stomach, and later fills the air, because nothing says frontier dining like shared digestive consequences. Over near the window, a pair of men are arguing over a poker debt, their bowls empty, their tempers rising. You keep your head down and spoon your stew like a monk in prayer. Lunch here isn't about savouring, it's about finishing before someone flips the table. You scrape the last bit from the bottom, catching a soft potato chunk soaked in meaty broth. It's not gourmet, but it's food. Barely. Still, you realize something strange. You're full. Not happy, not satisfied in the restaurant sense, but full enough to stand, tighten your belt, and head back into the sunlight without fainting. And that, really, is the whole point. One interesting fringe tidbit. Some saloons experimented with imported canned oysters. Yes, oysters, especially in boomtowns flush with gold and gamblers. These delicate mollusks arrived in battered tins, packed in brine and optimism, and were served on toast or crackers like some kind of coastal fever dream. They were weirdly popular among folks trying to prove they had class, even if they were eating seafood in a desert 900 miles from the ocean. You never had one. You're not that brave. Lunch winds down. Plates are collected without ceremony. The cook lights a cigarette and leans against the bar. Someone lets out a belch so profound it rattles the shutters. You walk back into the sunlight, stomach heavy, lips salty, and sweat already collecting under your collar. It wasn't much, but it was something. And out here, in this strange blend of survival and stubbornness, something is always better than nothing. You glance at the sun and know dinner is only a few hours away, and probably not much different. But for now, the stew holds, the beans settle, and the day marches on. Afternoon in the frontier town creeps in like a heat stroke wearing boots. The shadows shrink, the dust settles, and everyone moves a little slower, not for lack of will, but because the sun has declared war on all living things. You wander down the main road, past a dry goods store that smells like rope and molasses, and you catch the distant clank of a blacksmith hammering something into submission. It's the kind of heat that makes your bones feel like they've been slow cooked, and you find yourself longing for shade, maybe even a nap, if only the flies weren't so determined to ruin your life. There's not much to do in the afternoon, which is why so many folks turn to what you might generously call snacks. But let's be clear, this isn't the kind of snacking that involves chilled fruit or neatly sliced cheese. This is the kind of snacking born of boredom, desperation, and preserved goods that haven't seen daylight since the last administration. First on the menu, hardtack. Imagine a biscuit made of flour, water, and despair. Baked until it's hard enough to chip, a tooth and dense enough to sink a canoe. Hardtack was a staple for soldiers and settlers alike, not because it tasted good, but because it wouldn't go bad until the second coming. You'd bite into it carefully, gingerly, like it might bite back, and sometimes you'd soak it in, coffee or stew, just to make it chewable. There were even horror stories about worms hatching from older batches, which prompted folks to jokingly call it worm castles. You stare at a piece now, sitting on a barrel outside the general store like a dare, and decide maybe you're not that hungry after all. But then, beside it, is a jar of rock candy. Yes, rock candy. Crystals of sugar suspended on string, like science fair projects that somehow became edible. It's one of the few indulgences in this place, and children flock to it with sticky fingers and loud bargaining. Adults too, when they think no one's looking. Sugar was rare and expensive, which made rock candy a treasure. It didn't spoil, didn't melt, and lasted forever if you could resist sucking on it for an hour straight. Next to the candy is jerky, another classic frontier snack. Strips of meat dried until they resembled the business end of a leather strap, seasoned with salt and smoke and whatever spice was on hand, which was often just pepper or old coffee grounds. Chewing jerky isn't eating. It's more of a wrestling match between your molars and an unrepentant slab of cow. But it's full of protein, easy to carry, and unlikely to betray you in the heat, unlike butter or trust. You buy a piece and gnaw on it like a dog with a grudge. Then, just when you think you've tasted the full scope of frontier flavor, someone offers you pemmican. It's an old indigenous survival food later adopted by traders and explorers. Made of powdered dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries, pemmican is basically an energy bar designed to survive both winter and war. It looks like something scraped from a cave wall and tastes like meat-flavored candle wax, but it keeps you going when everything else fails. It was calorie-dense, durable, and nutritionally sound, if utterly joyless. People swore by it. Some even lived on it for weeks. You take a bite and immediately regret it, but also admire the ingenuity. The real secret of frontier snacking is that everything had to last. No refrigeration meant you either preserved it or watched it rot. That's why you saw so many dried apples hanging in kitchens, strung up like laundry. Apples were peeled, sliced and laid out in the sun to shrivel into chewy, tangy snacks. They were packed into jars or sacks and tossed into everything from pies to stews. And in a town where fruit was rarer than a bath, dried apples were a genuine treat. You find a few in a canvas bag at the store, taste one, and are pleasantly surprised to find a flavour that's not entirely sadness. It's sweet, it's tart, and it hasn't turned to mush. Win. Then there were nuts, pecans, walnuts, and whatever else could be foraged or traded. A handful of nuts could keep you on your feet for another couple of miles, or help distract your mouth from the taste of swampy well water. They were portable, packed with fat and protein, and didn't need cooking. Perfect for saddlebags, pocket, stashes, or bribing stubborn mules. And if you were lucky enough to have access to maple sugar or honey, you might even find candied nuts, a rarity that could bring a grown man to tears. You see a few in a tin near the counter. You don't ask how old they are. You just nod, accept them as currency, and chew slowly. Sometimes snacks weren't even food in the traditional sense. Some folks chewed rawhide. Yes, the stuff used for whips and laces. It was soaked in water until pliable and then chewed like gum, not for flavour, but for the sheer act of chewing. It kept your jaw moving, which staved off boredom, and sometimes hunger, though it gave nothing in return. The flavour was faintly cowhide with undertones of barn. You try a piece. You immediately regret trying a piece. For sweets, molasses was the go-to. It came in big tins or jugs and could be poured over bread, stirred into mush, or just eaten with a spoon if you didn't care about dignity. Thick, dark, and rich in iron, molasses was like liquid gold. Even saloons sometimes served molasses, candy, a sticky, taffy-like treat you had to peel off your teeth afterward with a nail. And then there were pickled eggs, the unofficial snack of every saloon with a dusty bar and a questionable backroom. Eggs boiled and soaked in vinegar, sometimes with beets, sometimes with spices, and always in a jar that had been refilled more times than anyone could count. The eggs turned pink, rubbery, and pungent. They weren't for the faint of heart, but if you could get past the smell, they packed protein and sharp flavour in one terrifying bite. You see one perched in a dusty jar, rotating slightly in the brine like it's aware of your gaze. You move on. Popcorn, believe it or not, was a popular snack when corn was in season. Popped over an open fire in kettles or pans, it was cheap, fast, and surprisingly fun. Kids ate it plain, while adults sometimes coated it in syrup or molasses to make sticky popcorn balls. And because it didn't require fancy tools or preservatives, it became a beloved treat at gatherings, dances, and even funerals. You pop a few kernels from a pouch someone's selling on the street. They taste like toasted corn and dust, which is better than many things you've had today. The longer you walk, the more you realize that frontier snacks were never meant to be elegant or even particularly tasty. They were survival tools, calories packed into pocket-sized forms, ready for travel or trade. They were made with what was on hand, adapted to whatever the environment could spare. In the absence of refrigeration, variety, or modern sensibilities, people learned to chew on whatever they could find that wouldn't kill them. As you settle into a shady porch, chewing on a chunk of jerky with the tenacity of a bulldog, you reflect on the weird resilience baked into these snacks. They're tough, unglamorous, and sometimes unsettling. But they did the job. They filled bellies, quieted nerves, and reminded people that even in the middle of nowhere, there was still something to eat. Even if it tasted like old barnwood, rolled in vinegar. A fly buzzes your face, you swat it lazily, and let the sun lull you into a half nap. The taste of molasses still lingers in your mouth, sticky and oddly comforting. Tomorrow, there'll be more stew, more beans, more hardtack. pretending to be food. But for now, you've had your fill of the edible oddities this town has to offer. You close your eyes. You chew. You endure. You wake up early again because everyone in this town seems to operate on some internal rooster that never takes a day off. And you step outside the creaky boarding house with sleep in your eyes and a question in your gut. What exactly did people drink in Wild West saloons when they weren't trying to black out with bottom-shelf whiskey? Because even you, after just one evening of watching toothless gamblers slosh mystery liquor into tin cups, wonder what else there was, if anything, that didn't threaten to turn your insides into a bonfire. You trudge back into the saloon, this time in the pale light of morning, and it's quieter, but not empty. A few lingering souls nurse drinks like medicine. Behind the bar, the saloon keeper eyes you warily, but doesn't protest when you ask about the beverages. So, let's get into it. This wasn't a world of endless options. You didn't exactly have aisles of kombucha or lattes with almond milk and a cinnamon dusting. You had what was available and what didn't go rancid in the heat. Coffee was king, if by king you mean murky black substance boiled over a fire until your cup had the texture of asphalt. It was usually made from ground beans, sometimes chicory if beans were too pricey, and it came strong, bitter, and served in the same tin cup you probably used to brush your teeth. But it did the job. You sip some. It tastes like betrayal. Still, it jolts your brain into motion, and that's the point. Tea was less common, but not absent, usually black tea, brewed to the point of violence, or herbal infusions made from local plants. Sage tea, mint, or even pine needle infusions were popular among those who couldn't afford imports. And in mining towns where Chinese immigrants set up communities, green tea and oolong showed up too, adding much-needed variety to the Wild West palate. But it wasn't just hot drinks. There were tonics and elixirs, those magical-sounding beverages that promised to cure everything from headaches to heartbreaks. And they came with names like Dr. Kilmer's Swamp Root or Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. Most of these drinks were frankly elaborate scams. Some were just alcohol mixed with sugar and herbs. Others added cocaine or opium for that extra medicinal kick. Historians still argue whether these potions did more harm than good. But at the time, people downed them eagerly, especially in towns where medical care was a one-eyed barber with a saw. You find a bottle of something called Red Hawk's Liver Invigorator, and are both intrigued and terrified. You sniff it. It smells like licorice, kerosene, and regret. Moving along. Then there's sarsaparilla. Yes, that beloved root beer-like. Concoction made from, well, sarsaparilla root. Sometimes it was real, sometimes it was just flavoured sugar water. Either way, it was marketed as a health tonic and quickly became one of the go-to drinks for those who wanted something sweet and fizzy without the soul-destroying aftermath of a whiskey binge. The first sip is oddly pleasant, like biting into a medicinal candy that decided to make friends. It tastes nostalgic, even though you've never had it before. But if you were looking for a buzz, there was always hard cider. Fermented apples didn't need refrigeration, and cider was common on homesteads where apples grew wild or were cultivated. It could be light and tangy or strong enough to strip paint, depending on the batch and the brewer's mood. Some folks even made perry, cider's pear-based cousin, which was rarer but not unknown. And of course, beer was everywhere. But it wasn't your craft brew IPA with hints of citrus and a quote from Thoreau on the label. This beer was rough, flat, and often warm. In larger towns with access to ice shipments or rudimentary refrigeration, it might be chilled, but most of the time it wasn't. And consistency was a joke. You could order a beer in one saloon and get something resembling soup, and in the next town over, the same request might land you a perfectly decent lager. You sip a local brew and try not to flinch. It tastes like old bread and disappointment. And what about wine, you ask? Rare, very rare. Imported bottles were expensive, fragile, and hard to come by. You'd find them in swankier saloons or at upper-class dinner parties, but in your average dusty outpost, not a chance. However, settlers from Europe sometimes brought grapevines and made their own wines in small batches, usually rough, usually cloudy, and sometimes explosive if bottled improperly. If someone handed you homemade wine, you accepted it with gratitude and a silent prayer to your internal organs. You wander over to a cowboy sipping something dark and foamy. "What's that?" you ask. He smirks. "Rot gut," the catch-all, term for the worst liquor imaginable. Could be whiskey, could be moonshine, could be turpentine's cousin, distilled locally, often from anything with sugar, molasses, corn, even potatoes, and left unfiltered. It was famous for causing blindness, insanity, or impromptu dance parties, depending on how it hit. You take a sip. Your vision doubles, then returns. You pass the cup back politely. Even milk, if you could find it, was an iffy proposition. It spoiled fast in the heat, and unless you had your own cow or lived near a dairy operation, fresh milk was a luxury. Some towns had condensed milk shipped in, canned, thick and sweet, usually used for baking or added to coffee for a luxurious treat. A tin of condensed milk was sometimes more valuable than gold in remote settlements. You watch a woman drizzle some into her cup of chicory and sigh with genuine bliss. And for hydration, good old water, when it was clean, which it often wasn't. Wells could be brackish, rivers polluted by mining runoff, and rain barrels full of algae and mosquito larvae. Boiling water helped, but wasn't always practiced. So people drank what they had, often adding a splash of alcohol, herbs, or vinegar to mask the flavor and kill the germs. One popular drink was switchel, made from water, vinegar, ginger, and molasses. Farmers drank it during haying season, and cowboys swore it kept them from keeling over under the sun. It tastes odd, but it's cold, tangy, and surprisingly refreshing. A frontier sports drink, if you will. Finally, there's lemonade. Simple, beloved, and occasionally available. Lemons weren't common, but when a shipment arrived, saloons and general stores would whip up big barrels of lemonade, sweet, tart, and precious. You sip some from a chipped mug and nearly weep. It's the best thing you've tasted in a week. In the end, you realize that drinking in the Wild West wasn't just about pleasure or even necessity. It was a gamble, just like everything else out here. You lifted your cup and rolled the dice. And whether you ended up refreshed, poisoned, or dancing shirtless in the street depended entirely on what was inside. You wipe your mouth, thank the barkeep, and step back into the rising sun, heart racing slightly from that mystery tonic, wondering what other liquid legends await you in this dusty adventure. You head out of the saloon with the strange taste of sarsaparilla and regret still on your tongue, blinking in the hazy sunlight like a confused prospector, and decide it's time to explore where all that Wild West food actually came from. Because, as rustic and romantic as it may seem to plop down at a wobbly table and order beans and bacon, someone had to cook it, and someone had to catch it, kill it, or grow it first. You make your way toward the edge of town, where the world smells less like sawdust and more like dust, and that's where you find them. The chuck wagon cooks, the silent alchemists of survival, stationed out on the open range with pots, bubbling over fires and hands permanently blackened by soot. These weren't just any cooks. They were the unsung lifelines of cattle drives, long wagon journeys, and homesteads barely clinging to the edge of civilization. You walk closer and the cook, a leathery man with a face like overcooked jerky, nods at you and ladles something brown and bubbling into a tin bowl. You sit, you stir, and you try not to ask too many questions about what part of what animal this might be. Because chuck wagon food was practical, not picky. It was about calories, preservation, and whatever could survive weeks on the trail. Beans, of course, were the cornerstone. Dried, hardy, and easy to rehydrate over a campfire, they showed up in nearly every meal, often cooked slowly with pork fat, salt, or if you were lucky, some chopped onion or dried pepper for flavor. They were hearty, filling, and made everyone remarkably gassy, which no one talked about because, frankly, everyone was guilty. Then came salt pork, cured, heavily salted slabs of pig that were packed in barrels and often came out looking more like fossils than food. It was tough, greasy, and needed serious cooking to become edible. But paired with beans, it worked. You bite into a chunk and your teeth recoil slightly, but you chew through it like a true pioneer. Historians still argue whether salt pork was genuinely beloved or simply tolerated because there were no alternatives. Either way, it kept people alive. Biscuits were another staple, not the fluffy, buttery clouds of modern diners, but hardtack-style dry biscuits made with flour, water, maybe some lard, and cooked in cast iron. They were often dunked in coffee or gravy just to soften the blow to your molars. You pick one, up. It feels like it could deflect bullets. You dunk, you chew, you survive. And for the sweet-toothed molasses and dried fruit made occasional appearances, packed in canvas bags or tins, and added to breads, pies, or porridge when supplies allowed. Apples and raisins were the most common, their sugars helping balance the constant intake of salt and grease. You watch the cook mash some dried apples into a pan with flour and lard, and soon you're biting into something that tastes vaguely like pie, vaguely like glue, and completely like victory. But it wasn't all beans and biscuits. Meat was everywhere, when it could be caught. Cowboys hunted jackrabbits, prairie chickens, and even rattlesnakes. Yes, rattlesnake. Skinned, cleaned, and fried, it was said to taste like chicken, which frankly feels like a default setting for anything unfamiliar. You watch a lanky ranch hand skewer a snake and roast it over the fire. He offers you a bite. It's chewy, vaguely, fishy, and somehow satisfying, like eating a legend. Game meat like deer, elk, and buffalo was prized, but harder to come by depending on the season and how hunted the area had become. By the 1880s, the bison population had been decimated, mostly thanks to reckless overhunting, military pressure, and the expansion of railroads. Still, in earlier decades, buffalo meat was a cornerstone. Roasted, dried into jerky, or ground into patties with suet and salt. You chew a piece of jerky that looks older than you and marvel at its strange, smoky sweetness. The cook tells you they also use dried meat in stews, soaking it until it softened enough to pretend it had never been dehydrated. You nod solemnly, swallowing with effort. Vegetables, predictably, were rare. Fresh greens wilted fast, and unless someone had a garden plot nearby or a shipment arrived by train, scurvy was always a looming threat. So cooks turned to root vegetables, potatoes, onions, carrots, which lasted longer and added crucial nutrients to the mix. Dried or canned vegetables were also used when possible, though expensive. A tin of tomatoes, a can of corn. These were treasures on the frontier. You sip some stew and spot a potato chunk. You nearly cry. Butter, eggs, and milk. Only if there was a cow around, and even then, those ingredients were usually reserved for baking, holidays, or bribing the local sheriff. Powdered eggs existed, but they were infamous for tasting like cardboard nightmares. The cook throws some into a skillet, and they puff up in a weirdly optimistic way, before collapsing into something resembling yellow lava. You eat a bite out of respect, and don't even ask about cheese unless you were lucky enough to know someone who made it, which often meant a ranch wife with more patience than sleep. For sweeteners, aside from molasses, sugar was a luxury. Honey was more common, harvested from wild hives or traded with settlers. Syrups made from sorghum or corn also sweetened the pot, literally used in porridge, pancakes, or drinks like switchel. You watch the cook drizzle sorghum syrup on a fried bread disc and suddenly understand why people fought over rations. Speaking of fried bread, Native American influence shows up here too. You're handed a golden piece of fry bread, crisp on the outside, soft inside, and slightly sweet. It's delicious, simple, adaptable, and born from resourcefulness. It tells its own story of survival. And let's not forget canned goods. By the late 1800s, canning was revolutionizing frontier food. Beans, meats, fruits, all preserved in tins and sold at general stores. The downside? Exploding cans, botulism, and the taste of metal. But the upside? Fruit cocktail in the middle of nowhere. You open a can and spoon out something that's probably a peach. You hope. You eat it anyway. Food on the frontier wasn't about indulgence. It was about staying alive, staying strong, and occasionally, if luck permitted, enjoying a hot bite of something that didn't come from a barrel. And behind every campfire was a cook keeping, that delicate balance between nutrition and flavor with nothing but a Dutch oven, a skillet, and the eternal hope that tonight no one would complain. You thank the chuckwagon cook, rinse your bowl in a bucket of suspicious water, and walk back toward town, belly full, heart warmed, and breath slightly smoky. You're starting to understand that life out here was a constant negotiation with hunger and hope, and those who fed the frontier were often the true quiet heroes. You wake up the next morning still digesting beans and questionable biscuits, the scent of smoke and last night's salt pork clinging stubbornly to your clothes. And now your feet guide you toward the town's only general store, a modest, dusty establishment that smells like rope, old flour, and desperation. The bell above the door rings with a metallic clang as you step in, and suddenly you're surrounded by shelves stacked with tins, barrels, sacks, and glass jars, the lifeblood of the Wild West pantry. This is where menus began, not in kitchens, but here, with whatever could be shipped, stored, or scavenged from nearby settlements. You wander the aisles, and it becomes immediately clear you weren't picking your dinner based on a recipe, but on what didn't have weevils in it. Flour, for instance, wasn't just a baking staple, it was the blank canvas of frontier cuisine, forming the base of bread, biscuits, and gravy. It arrived in 100-pound sacks, sometimes bleached with bone ash or alum to preserve it. And if you managed to get through a bag without finding bugs, that was a small frontier miracle. You reach into a bin and feel the fine powder sift between your fingers. This was gold to a frontier cook. Alongside it are sacks of cornmeal, used to make cornbread, mush, or johnny cakes, which were fried on griddles with lard or bacon drippings until crispy and yellow as the sun. The texture was gritty, the flavor humble, but the comfort level was off the charts. You spot molasses in a large jug, a thick, dark syrup that served as sweetener, sauce base, and the occasional medicinal syrup. Because if something tasted that strong, it had to be doing something good inside your body. Sugar was available, but expensive and often coarse, stored in large cones that needed to be chipped with a knife and ground down. Still, it was beloved for special recipes, pies, crumbles, or even just stirred into coffee to take the edge off the bitter frontier mornings. Nearby, a stack of blue label tins gleams, canned peaches, beans, tomatoes, and evaporated milk. The labels are cheerful, almost mocking, considering their metallic contents. But to a settler who hadn't tasted fruit in weeks, that syrup-drenched slice of peach was worth its weight in gold. You pop a can open, because of course someone left a tin opener nailed to the wall, and spoon out a chunk of pineapple. It tastes faintly metallic, questionably tropical, and utterly glorious. The general store also carried the mysterious realm of dried goods, raisins, prunes, dried apples, even desiccated carrots or potatoes. These needed soaking before they were even remotely edible, but they gave vital flavor and fiber to stews or porridges. You chew on a dried apple ring and wonder if your teeth will ever forgive you. Jars of pickled goods also line a back shelf: cucumbers, beets, onions, and eggs, bobbing ominously in cloudy vinegar. A single pickled egg floats like a forgotten dare in a grimy jar. You stare at it, the clerk stares at you, and you wisely walk away. Then there's coffee, a frontier essential, not the artisanal beans of today, but rough green coffee shipped in burlap sacks and roasted at home over open flames. Grounds were often reused or mixed with chicory root or burnt breadcrumbs to stretch the brew. It was strong, bitter, and left your teeth stained like old oak fence posts. But it kept people awake, alert, and alive. And that's all anyone could ask. You sniff a tin of beans and inhale equal parts comfort and caffeine addiction. Next comes the meat. Not fresh cuts, unless someone just rode in with a deer or traded a few chickens, but preserved meat, salt pork, dried beef, and canned mutton. The dried beef is thin, hard, and slightly translucent, like edible parchment. It was shredded into stews or eaten as is. You nibble and feel like you're chewing history. And speaking of history, the most mysterious item on the shelf is pemmican, a blend of dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries, adopted from indigenous practices. It was high-calorie, shelf-stable, and entirely indifferent to your taste preferences. Think of it as the original protein bar, except with more sinew and fewer marketing campaigns. You unwrap a lump of it from wax paper and take a bite. It's chewy, savory, and surprisingly satisfying, if you don't think too hard. Over in the corner, stacked neatly like small bricks, are bouillon cubes, salt-packed flavor bombs that turned hot water into soup. One cube could transform boiled potatoes into something approaching a meal. In fact, some folks claimed these cubes saved marriages because flavor was often the last thing standing between a husband and a frying pan. And then you find the dried herbs and spices, limited but present, oregano, sage, mustard seed, and the ubiquitous black pepper. Even on the frontier, people wanted food to taste like something. Pepper was used to season meat, disguise spoilage, and once, allegedly, to treat toothaches. Because what else were you going to do, really? Salt, of course, was everywhere, preserving meat, pickling vegetables, flavoring everything else, and sometimes even used as currency in remote areas. You grab a small cloth bag of it, surprisingly heavy, and realize just how precious the basics were in a world where the next shipment might not arrive for months. But the general store wasn't just about what you ate. It stocked the tools that made eating possible: Dutch ovens, cast iron pans, long-handled ladles, and the most essential kitchen item of all, a good knife. These were used daily, sharpened religiously, and passed down like family heirlooms. You pick one up and feel the weight of meals passed in its handle. Historians still argue whether these humble tools did more to shape Western food culture than any fancy recipe ever did. You're beginning to agree. You also spot a barrel of lard, an all-purpose fat used in frying, baking, greasing pans, and occasionally greasing mustaches. Alongside it, small tins of baking soda and cream of tartar. For leavening, and yes, even yeast cakes wrapped in paper, there's a fragile ecosystem of ingredients here. Just enough to keep the frontier cook creative, barely enough to prevent food fatigue. And yet, people made it work. They created meals that were nourishing, flavorful, and comforting in a world where those three words didn't always show up together. And the secret ingredient, more than salt, sugar, or lard: sheer determination. You leave the store, arms full of tins, sacks, and the weird aftertaste of pickled something still in your mouth. You walk back toward the heart of town, past the saloon, past the jailhouse, past a man hauling firewood with one hand and a pie tin in the other. You realize that food wasn't just survival out here. It was sanity, ritual, and sometimes, when the stars aligned and the beans didn't burn, even joy. As evening rolls in again and the sun dips below the jagged horizon like it's embarrassed by what it saw all day, you find yourself pulled back toward the saloon, drawn this time not by the promise of dinner, but by the sound of something sizzling in the back. The cook has returned, apron stained, bandana tied tight, and face shiny from both sweat and bacon grease. You slip through the side door like a curious raccoon and immediately get walloped in the face by a dozen competing aromas. Onions caramelizing in a cast-iron pan, bacon practically weeping fat onto a metal tray, cornbread fresh from the Dutch oven cooling on a makeshift shelf, and something meaty simmering in a deep pot that looks older than the state itself. Tonight's menu is something of a miracle, not because it's fancy, but because it even exists. You pull up a stool and take mental notes as the cook throws together what might generously be called frontier fusion. The main dish is a skillet of hash, a glorious, sizzling pile of chopped salt beef, diced potatoes, bits of onion, and an egg cracked right into the center. The potatoes are fried golden, the beef crisped on the edges, and the onion is that perfect translucent brown line between sweet and scorched. It's a meal that would make any city chef weep with joy and cholesterol fear. But it's not just about what's being cooked. It's how it's being cooked. Everything here depends on cast iron. Dutch ovens, griddles, skillets, all of them heavy, blackened with use, and passed from one cook to another like sacred relics. The cast iron retains heat, survives open flame, and adds that distinctive flavor known only to those who've eaten bacon fried in the same pan as 10 other meals. A particularly enthusiastic cook might even say the pan remembers. And yes, there are still arguments among historians over whether the cast iron skillet did more to civilize the West than the railroad. You're leaning toward yes. Tonight's bread is cornbread, made with white cornmeal, sour milk, and bacon drippings. Because why not? It's baked in a shallow iron pan until the top goes golden and cracks slightly down the middle like parched earth. You tear off a piece, still steaming, and it's got that perfect balance of grit and fluff. Smear a little molasses on it, and it's suddenly dessert. Over in the corner, there's a bubbling pot of beans. Not the sad grey afterthoughts you're used to, but proper slow-cooked beans with salt pork, molasses, onions, and just a hint of mustard powder. They're rich, earthy, and so deeply satisfying, you start to question whether your modern diet is a lie. One bite, and you're transported to a world where beans weren't side dishes. They were main events. The drink tonight isn't whiskey or coffee, but sarsaparilla, a sweet, slightly spicy root beverage brewed on site from bark, herbs, and enough sugar to reanimate a dead horse. It's served warm, poured into a tin cup from a steaming kettle, and tastes somewhere between root beer and a campfire. People believed it was medicinal, good for cleansing the blood, whatever that meant. You take a sip and feel your blood judged. For dessert, yes, there's dessert. The cook produces a surprisingly elegant dish, apple pandowdy. It's a pie-adjacent mess of spiced apples baked under a crust of biscuit dough, with molasses and brown sugar bubbling up through the cracks. The top is crunchy, the inside gooey, and each bite is a chaotic blend of fruit, spice, and hot syrup. The name might be ridiculous, but the taste is not. You burn your tongue and don't even care. What's fascinating is how regional these dishes can be. In some towns, it's all chili and sourdough. In others, tamales made by Mexican laborers share the table with fried catfish and greens brought west by African-American cooks. You might find German schnitzel in Kansas, Scandinavian rye bread in Minnesota, or Chinese noodles in San Francisco. The Wild West wasn't just wild. It was a culinary collision zone. And saloon kitchens, despite their grease stains and pan fires, were the epicenter. Take, for example, a story you overhear from the next table, about a woman known only as Chili, Sue, who allegedly fed an entire cattle drive with nothing but beans, beef scraps, and her secret spice mix. Historians still argue whether she actually existed, or if she was a folk invention cooked up by hungry cowhands, desperate to mythologize their lunch. Either way, her chili left a legacy. And let's not forget the flapjacks, thick, chewy pancakes fried in bacon grease and stacked like roof shingles. These weren't your modern, airy delights. These were working man's fuel, sometimes made with sourdough starter that had been kept alive since the cook's great-grandma crossed the plains. Add a drizzle of molasses or a smear of jelly, and suddenly you were eating something that felt like a reward. Eggs, when available, were scrambled quickly over open flames, their edges going brown and crispy before the centers were fully set. They were often paired with chopped game, rabbit, squirrel, or venison, depending on who had the best aim that morning. And if you were lucky enough to have cheese, you grated it right in, watching it melt into glorious strings across the meat. The result was rustic, rich, and strangely sophisticated for something cooked by firelight with one hand and swatted flies with the other. Occasionally, you'd get a stew that defied logic, maybe some beef or game meat, thickened with flour or cornmeal, filled with root vegetables and spiced with whatever was on hand, pepper, sage, or if the cook was bold, a crushed chili. A single bowl of this stuff could carry you through the worst snowstorm. And yes, there are tales of people surviving entire winters on just stew and hard bread, which says as much about the stew as it does about human stubbornness. One quirky tradition you hear about is the cook-off challenge. where two saloon cooks would compete over who could whip up the best fried potatoes with the fewest ingredients. People would bet on the winner, and the losing cook would have to do dishes for a week. It was low-stakes drama, but it gave flavor to otherwise long, dusty days. A few towns even published little recipe pamphlets, some real, some satirical, with titles like Meals on Hooves or Saloons and Spoons. You find one wedged behind the flour sacks, its pages stuck together with grease and pride. As you flip through, a single page falls out with a recipe for trailside meat pie, scrawled in almost legible handwriting. You tuck it into your coat like a treasure. By the time the kitchen starts to cool and the last flapjack is flipped, the cook leans against the doorway with a satisfied grunt and a smudge of flour across his cheek. The fire crackles lower, the last beans bubble quietly, and you realize how much of the West was written not in laws or maps, but in grease, spice, and the courage to mix whatever was left in the bag. Food here wasn't just sustenance, it was resilience, improvisation, and occasionally poetry fried in a pan. You ease into another evening at the saloon, but this time your focus isn't on the plate in front of you, though, let's be real, you're still nursing a tin cup of lukewarm coffee that's strong enough to strip the paint off a fence, but rather on the men and women running the joint. Because as much as Wild West saloons were known for gunfights and gambling, they were also complex little ecosystems, and someone had to keep them from descending into full-blown chaos. That someone was usually the saloon keeper, often just called the barkeep or boss, and they were a very particular breed. You watch from your perch near the stove as tonight's barkeep wipes down the long bar with an expression that suggests he's both seen too much and isn't surprised by anything anymore. That guy in the corner with a pet badger? Fine. Someone trying to pay with gold flakes still stuck to their boots? Sure. Someone passed out face down in a plate of beans. Happens every Thursday. Running a saloon wasn't just about pouring drinks. It was a balancing act between diplomacy, showmanship, basic accounting, and low-level emergency response. The saloon keeper had to know who owed how much, who could be trusted with a tab, who was likely to get violent, and who was likely to cause someone else to get violent. They controlled the music, often operated the games, handled deliveries, negotiated with local authorities, or bribed them, and served as makeshift therapists to travelers, ranch hands, and miners who hadn't seen their families, or a decent bath, in months. One mainstream fact. Many of these saloon owners weren't hardened criminals or ex-outlaws, but savvy entrepreneurs. They saw a business opportunity in supplying vice to a thirsty, bored, and frequently lonely population. Some made small fortunes doing it. The legend of Wyatt Earp owning part of a saloon in Tombstone, true, and he wasn't alone. Civil War veterans, failed farmers, retired lawmen, and even Eastern businessmen all tried their hand at saloon keeping. What they lacked in polish they made up for in grit and good instincts. You learn quickly that the barkeep keeps a loaded shotgun under the bar, not because he's eager to use it, but because sometimes threats weren't just idle bar talk. There's also a lead-filled sapstick under the register, just in case. Someone needs to be gently reminded that poker's a gentleman's game. But despite the weapons, there's an art to de-escalation. You see it play out when two gamblers nearly come to blows over a hand of faro. The barkeep doesn't yell, doesn't reach for the gun. He just says, quietly but clearly, "One of y'all owes me for 3 drinks and a broken chair last week. Don't make it 4. And just like that, tension dissolves into muttered curses and 2 beers on the house. It's not always that easy, of course. Fights break out, chairs get smashed. Sometimes people do draw, but most saloons had a set of unwritten rules. If you wanted to drink, gamble, or dance, you followed them, or you left. And if you didn't leave, the barkeep called in the bouncer. Here's where it gets quirky. In some places, the bouncer wasn't a massive man with fists like bricks, but a wiry little woman with a mean left hook and a louder voice than a church bell. There's a story, part true, part campfire legend, about a saloon in Cheyenne where the bouncer was a former opera singer named Jenny Jawbreaker Lang. She once ejected 5 cowboys at once by threatening to sing until their ears bled. Historians still argue whether she was real or invented by bored reporters, but her name lives on in barroom toasts. Women played more roles in saloons than you might think. Beyond entertainers and servers, some women ran the saloons themselves. They managed the books, made the food, handled the stock, and knew exactly which customers were trouble before they even stepped through the swinging doors. A few even became local legends, like Kitty Leroy, who owned her own establishment, dressed like a man, and was said to have married 5 times, though not all the husbands lived to complain. Your modern instincts might think of the Old West as purely male, but in the saloon, women had agency, presence, and power, sometimes wielded with a shotgun, sometimes with a sharp word. Behind the bar, another overlooked fixture is the mirror. Large, ornate, and usually cracked in one corner, the saloon mirror was more than decoration. It allowed the barkeep to see what was happening behind him, served as a deterrent to would-be troublemakers, and perhaps most importantly, gave patrons the chance to inspect themselves after several drinks and regret their life choices in real time. Watching someone squint at their reflection and then pour another whiskey is its own kind of poetry. You also learn about the saloon's running tabs, chalk marks behind the counter, coded symbols only the barkeep could decipher. Some tabs went unpaid for years. Others were cleared with gold dust, furs, or services rendered. One guy, legend, has it, paid his bar debt by playing harmonica every Friday night for 3 winters straight. They say he wasn't good, but he was loud, and that counted for something. There's also the story of a bartender who turned away a wealthy cattle baron because he was rude to the kitchen staff. Sounds too perfect to be real, but locals swear it happened, and in some ways, it makes sense. In places with no law or church, the saloon was often the closest thing to a social contract. You followed the barkeep's rules, or you didn't come back. And if you didn't come back, well, you were out of warmth, food, company, and sometimes protection. Saloons weren't just watering holes. They were the town's unofficial courtrooms, newsrooms, post offices, and stages. Information spread faster here than through any telegraph. If you wanted to know who got shot, who got married, or who was running for sheriff, you asked the barkeep. They knew everything. They had to. That tin cup of coffee you're still sipping. It's been refilled 3 times now, and each time it tastes a little stronger, a little older, like the pot itself is evolving. The barkeep notices your expression and smirks, saying, "That pot's older than my horse." You're not sure whether he means that proudly or as a warning. Probably both. As the evening deepens and the saloon fills with laughter, music, and arguments about who won what last week, you realize the keeper of this chaotic kingdom stands behind the bar like a lighthouse in a storm, wiping glasses, settling bets, giving the occasional side-eye to someone testing the rules. They're not just pouring drinks, they're holding the whole story together. You're still tucked into your favorite corner of the saloon, the wooden bench now creaking just a little more than usual as the fire pops lazily in the stove nearby. But tonight's curiosity doesn't lie with the barkeep or the poker tables. No, tonight your focus is drifting towards something more primal, something you smell long before you see it. The thick, greasy aroma of food being scraped off a plate in the corner. The truth is, the Wild West wasn't just wild because of its shootouts and outlaws. It was wild because it had absolutely no culinary rules. You look around at the current offerings and realize that while people may have risked their lives, to find gold, they often risked their stomach lining for supper. Out here, the menu was more a suggestion than a guarantee. One mainstream fact: saloons rarely served full meals. Instead, they often offered what was called free lunch to patrons, with the catch being that you had to buy a drink to get it. These weren't lavish spreads. Usually, you were lucky if you got some stale bread, cold beans, pickled pig's feet, or maybe a chunk of cheese that had known better days. But in towns where food was scarce and wages uncertain, that free lunch could keep you going until the next payday. Some saloons leaned into the grift with glorious flair, offering salty meats and snacks designed to make you even thirstier. The house wins, every time. One story goes that in Leadville, Colorado, a saloon served free sardines so salty they made grown men weep, then sold more beer than any place in town. You look down at a current plate and question your life choices. A hard-boiled egg, a greenish pickle, and a square of meat that might be beef but smells more like forgotten ham. And that's one of the better offerings. Historians still argue whether the term free lunch was invented by saloon owners or simply co-opted by them from older traditions. But there's no doubt the phrase took root in the American lexicon here, where a little bait and switch. Marketing helped keep the bar stools filled. And then there were the establishments that tried to go upscale. Picture this: a saloon with linen napkins, a man in a bow tie carving roast beef tableside, and a wine list that includes something other than red or white, sir. It sounds like a fever dream, but it happened. In bigger towns like San Francisco, Denver, and Kansas City, some saloons did their best impression of high society. These places served oysters. Yes, oysters, often shipped on ice from the East Coast or plucked from muddy rivers, along with steak, fresh vegetables, and elaborate desserts. One such dish: oyster stew with cream, butter, and black pepper served with toast. Not bad for a saloon built on the same street as a blacksmith and a brothel. The fringe reality: sometimes those oysters were preserved in questionable brine and had travelled thousands of miles on unreliable trains with even more unreliable ice. If you didn't get food poisoning, you got a great story. And then, of course, there were the off-menu surprises. One well-worn tale tells of a barkeep in Arizona who served chili so spicy it caused a traveling preacher to pass out mid-sermon. Another legend claims a Nevada saloon owner once invented a stew from jackrabbit, cactus pulp, and whiskey, though that might have just been his way of getting rid of leftovers. You realize that while the food varied wildly, what stayed consistent was the attitude. Eat what's there, don't ask too many questions, and if your meal comes with bread, be grateful it's only slightly moldy. There's a practical reason. Saloon food was often dreadful. Supplies were limited. Most towns relied on canned goods, salted meats, and whatever root vegetables could survive the journey. Potatoes, onions, and turnips were common. Spices were rare. And refrigeration? Forget about it. That meant even a simple dish like hash, chopped meat, potatoes, and onions fried on a skillet, was a minor miracle of logistics and luck. Still, it could be delicious, especially when cooked over an open fire by someone who cared. Occasionally, a traveling chef or ambitious saloon owner would bring a bit of flair to the frontier. You'd hear about a famous meatloaf recipe from back east, or a stew thickened with flour and flavored with paprika brought over by Hungarian immigrants. Every now and then, someone would show up with a Dutch oven and change lives for a week. But those moments were rare. Most of the time, your choices were grease, salt, or regret. Still, you're surprised at how much community was built around these meals. Everyone ate together, whether they'd just won big at the tables or lost their boots in a bad bet. A plate of food was an equalizer, a moment of normalcy in a place that didn't often offer one. You see a cowboy hand half his sandwich to a stranger without speaking. A miner shares the last spoonful of stew with the bartender. In a place where law was sometimes flexible and hygiene was definitely optional, generosity still mattered. Quirky fact: some saloons used food as an entry test. One place in Wyoming was rumored to offer a plate of mystery meat stew to newcomers just to see if they had the guts or the stomach for frontier life. If you gagged, you were laughed at. If you asked for seconds, you were family. And every town had its version of that test. Even the utensils told a story: forks bent from overuse, knives that doubled as tools, tin plates so warped they spun like coins when set down. You think of your modern dishwasher and wonder how anyone survived without getting tetanus nightly. But here you are, in a room full of people eating questionable food with great enthusiasm. Because out here, flavor was optional. Calories were currency. As the evening winds on, you see one last peculiar sight. A man carefully unwrapping a cloth napkin to reveal a hard biscuit and a strip of dried meat. He doesn't order anything. Just eats in silence, nods to the barkeep, and slips out into the night. Some people didn't trust saloon food, no matter how hungry they were. Others swore by it. There's no consensus, no rating system, no one-star Yelp review for the squirrel stew. There's only the moment, the meal, and the memory. And somehow, in this strange, salty corner of history, that's enough. You're still perched at your rickety table as the heat from the potbelly stove ebbs and flows like a sleepy tide, and now your attention wanders not just to the food itself, but to who's making it and why they might not want you poking around the kitchen. You see, behind every mysterious stew pot and questionable cut of meat in a Wild West saloon, there was usually a person just trying to make a living, often with no culinary training whatsoever. The cook in a saloon wasn't always a chef. In fact, more often than not, they were whoever could stand the heat, had a strong stomach, and could keep rodents out of the flour bin, a mainstream historical fact. Many saloon cooks were immigrants, Chinese, Mexican, or Eastern European, who brought their own food traditions with them and often adapted on the fly to limited supplies. This created some fascinating mashups: tamales stuffed with salted beef instead of pork, or dumplings floating in chili instead of broth. You didn't come to the West to be impressed by your plate. You came to survive it. But that survival came with flavor, and every now and then, even joy. One fringe tidbit. In the mining towns of Colorado, Chinese cooks often used tea not just for drinking, but for braising meat, adding unexpected layers of earthiness to otherwise bland dishes. The fusion was accidental, but memorable. Imagine beef simmered in lapsang souchong and served with overcooked turnips. It may not win awards, but it was deeply appreciated after 12 hours underground. The kitchen was also a site of quiet rebellion. While the saloon up front buzzed with card games, shootouts, and off-key piano music, the cook had their own empire in the back. If they liked you, your beans came with a bit more pork fat. If you insulted their gravy, you might find your biscuit curiously missing. And don't even think about asking for seconds unless you said please. Historians still argue whether Wild West saloon cooks had formal titles, or if Cookie, the backroom wizard, or that meat wizard were invented later in dime novels, but they certainly held more power than most patrons realized. Some even wielded literal power. A well-known cook in Montana reportedly threatened to close the saloon kitchen entirely unless he was given Sundays off to nap and fish. He got his way. You realize quickly that the saloon's menu wasn't just shaped by ingredients or skill, it was shaped by personality. One woman in Kansas City became famous for her devil's eggs, hard-boiled eggs doused in horseradish and vinegar, and delivered with a smile that dared you to complain. Another man in New Mexico cooked everything in lard, literally everything, because he believed it warded off scurvy. It didn't, but it did give his cornbread a crunch people still talked about years later. These oddball culinary choices weren't just tolerated, they were embraced. Out here, the cook's quirks became legend, even part of the town's identity. People would travel miles just to try a stew that tastes like it's looking back at you. And despite the unpredictable textures and flavors, you'd find yourself slowly learning to appreciate the chaos. There was something comforting in the way a meal could be both terrible and unforgettable. You now understand that out here, it wasn't about fine dining, it was about consistency. The stew might be oily, the beans might be undercooked, but if it was the same every Thursday, folks lined up like clockwork. There's even an unspoken ritual forming as you look around. A man dips his bread in coffee, another folds his napkin, just so before stabbing his pork slab. These are habits formed not from taste but from rhythm, rituals to make the uncertain feel familiar. And sometimes the cook would push the boundaries entirely. Ever heard of cactus pie? Neither had most people, until they wandered into a small Arizona saloon where the cook had run out of flour and decided mashed prickly pear pulp might hold its shape if baked long enough. It didn't, but the resulting purple goo was reportedly less awful than expected. And that was enough to earn repeat customers. A quirky fact: one cook in Oregon refused to use salt. He believed it corrupted the soul. Instead, he seasoned everything with dried herbs he collected during mourning. Walks. His food tasted like spicy moss, but he became something of a spiritual icon among the regulars. Nobody knows if he ever bathed. As you sit there, half listening to a man at the next table complain that his meat tastes like boot leather soaked in vinegar, you realize that the cook hears every word. Without even looking up, she claps her hands and yells, "Then stop ordering. It, Frank." The whole saloon laughs. That's another thing about saloon cooks. They weren't shy. They had to be bold, not just in seasoning, or the lack thereof, but in presence. They often managed staff, kept the peace, and handled both supply chains and soap shortages. In many ways, they were the unsung managers of the entire establishment. Some of them even slept in the kitchens, curled up next to the stove or in pantries, thick with the smell of onions and wood smoke. That smell sticks with you. The saloon kitchen isn't clean by modern standards, not even close. You'd fail every health inspection before you made it to the pantry door. But for the time, it was normal. Flies buzzed, mice scurried, and occasionally a raccoon had to be shooed off the flour sacks. You take a mental note never to ask where the bread crust came from. But even in the grime and clutter, there's something almost sacred about the space. It's where people went to feed not just their stomachs, but their sense of hope. A hot meal, no matter how gritty or bland, was a reminder that you'd made it through another day. And in the Wild West, that was no small feat. So you lift your fork once more, offer a silent thanks to whoever's sweating in the back over an open flame and a cracked pot, and you take another bite of something vaguely brown and mysteriously chewy. You won't ask what it is. Out here, sometimes not knowing is part of the magic. Now your boots creak against uneven floorboards as you shift in your seat, and your eyes drift toward the saloon's bar, not for a drink just yet, but to consider the bizarre menu items posted on a smudged chalkboard behind the counter. They're written in half-legible scrawl and range from prairie surprise to buffalo bits in gravy, and you can't help but wonder, who's naming these dishes? And more importantly, what incarnation are they made of? See, the Wild West had its own food marketing strategy, and it was less about accuracy and more about evoking an appetite, or at least curiosity. Buffalo oysters, for example, was not some coastal delicacy magically teleported to Kansas, but rather a euphemism for deep-fried, well, let's just say parts of the buffalo that most folks wouldn't dare eat unless they'd already lost 2 teeth and 3 days of dignity. That's your quirky tidbit for the night. And it wasn't just about disguising ingredients with colourful names. Sometimes the names were born from desperation. Desert jerky might mean sun-dried rabbit, if you were lucky, or strips of squirrel that had been smoked over a cactus fire. Bark stew could either mean it had some actual tree bark as filler, or that the cook had just given up naming things entirely. Historians still argue whether the naming conventions of frontier food were influenced more by regional humour or sheer necessity. But either way, you had to be brave or very hungry to order without asking. But here's your mainstream fact. Buffalo really was a staple protein, especially before overhunting made them scarce. Steaks, stews, even raw buffalo marrow cracked from bones were considered hearty meals, especially in areas with fewer supply wagons. The meat was lean and tough, which meant it often had to be cooked for hours or pounded into oblivion to become even remotely chewable. Still, people swore by it. Some even claimed it made a man's spine straighten, probably from all the jaw work involved. And that's the thing. You couldn't be squeamish. The West didn't allow it. If you wanted to survive, you learned to accept the chewy, the gritty, and the vaguely suspicious. What looked like fried chicken might be fried. Jackrabbit, that beef tongue sandwich, could have come from a steer or from something less clearly identified. A cook might stretch a stew by tossing in potatoes if they had any, or thickening it with yesterday's stale bread mashed into paste. Waste not, want not. But it wasn't all doom stew and mystery meat. Some dishes were genuinely innovative. In Nevada, mining towns, where miners craved high-calorie meals, cooks developed a dish called slagpot hash, a mix of chopped salted beef, potatoes, onions, and gravy, all fried together until it resembled the rocky ore they spent their days chipping at. It tasted better than it looked, unless you were hungover, in which case the sheer smell of it could bring you to your knees. Then there were the layered tricks of the saloon specials. You'd sometimes get Sunday roast that had never seen an oven, just a boiled slab of mutton charred over a flame and drowned in lard-based gravy. Or you might try the stagecoach platter, which could include corn dodgers, beans, a slice of jerky, and a single fried egg that looked like it had fought a losing battle against the skillet. It was oddly filling, and a good deal if you didn't mind the egg staring at you like it had questions, and behind every strange name was usually a story. Desert pancake was once served by a saloon cook who claimed the batter recipe came from an Apache woman who taught her how to thicken cornmeal with yucca flour. Whether true or not, the pancakes were dense enough to use as roof shingles, but customers came back again and again. That same cook named her biscuits ankle busters, because once they cooled, they were hard enough to break toes if dropped. Legend has it, she used one as a doorstop for 2 years. Humour and food always walked hand in hand out here. You had to laugh when your dinner bounced off the plate. You had to chuckle when your cream gravy was beige and sour enough to peel paint. Because if you didn't, the reality of what you were eating might catch up with you. And it's not like there were alternatives. No DoorDash, no farm to table, just whatever we could scrape up and make hot. You hear a man next to you now ask the bartender what's in the range skillet. The bartender just shrugs and says, "Stuff." That's the answer, just stuff. And somehow, it's enough. You chew and nod and realize that part of the charm of the Wild West saloon menu wasn't in knowing what you were eating. It was in surviving it and living to tell the tale. There's comfort in the consistency, in knowing that stuff always tastes like stuff, whether it's yesterday's stew or tomorrow's meatloaf. In some ways, that's more honest than any city restaurant. They weren't pretending it was gourmet. They weren't even pretending it was edible, but it was food. It kept you alive. And sometimes, it made you laugh. There's also a subtle camaraderie built into eating this way. You bond with strangers over questionable gravy. You trade bites of jerky to see who got the tougher cut. You whisper to the new guy, "Don't eat the pickled eggs unless you got 2 days off work." It becomes communal, like you're all in on the same weird joke. So the next time you read a menu item like Dusty Trail Chowder or Spittoon Beans, remember that somewhere in the back, a cook invented that name with a grin and a ladle full of mystery. And you, well, you're the brave soul who ordered it. You sit back in your rickety saloon chair, belly a little fuller than you'd expected after tackling that range skillet, which you're now fairly convinced included at least one diced prairie dog, though you're not about to ask. It's quiet. Again, save for the clink of glasses and the mournful squeak of a fiddle, trying to remember how turkey in the straw is supposed to go. Your fingers idly trace the rim of a tin cup as your mind drifts to the most common staple you've seen. Pass from kitchen to table beans. They're in everything. They're everywhere. And in the Wild West, beans were practically a food group unto themselves. Not glamorous, not flashy, but dependable as a shotgun and just as necessary. They were cheap, non-perishable, easy to transport, and filling enough to keep a cowboy from passing out on a cattle drive. Pinto, navy, kidney, black, whatever could be grown or traded in bulk. And when meat was scarce, which it often was, beans stood in as both protein and comfort, food. A proper pot of beans simmered low and slow, sometimes overnight, with maybe a bone or bit of salt pork thrown in for flavour. That's your mainstream historical fact right there. Beans were the unofficial backbone of cowboy cuisine, and a good cook could make or break a trail crew's morale based on whether his beans had any kick. But things got weird when folks got creative. Beans ended up in pies, in coffee, even ground into flour to stretch out hardtack or thicken stew. Your quirky tidbit? Some cooks swore by soaking beans in whiskey before boiling them, said it made them dance on the tongue. Others, perhaps not understanding science, buried their bean pots underground, claiming the earth's deep heat improved the flavour. What they probably got was mild food poisoning and a generous helping of grit. But hey, anything for flavour. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of beans was born of necessity alone, or if regional Mexican and native culinary influences shaped the frontier's bean obsession. After all, ranchers moving through New Mexico and Arizona would have encountered frijoles and nopales cooked in earthen pots, seasoned with chiles, garlic, and maybe even cumin. A far cry from the grey mush some saloons called chili. Speaking of which, chili in the Wild West was an adventure unto itself. In Texas, you might get something halfway respectable, chunks of beef slow-cooked with dried peppers, and maybe tomatoes, if they were in season. But most frontier versions were mystery meat medleys swimming in a pool of grease and regret. Some cooks tossed in squirrel, others used jackrabbit, rattlesnake, or whatever the trapper dragged in. 3-alarm chili didn't mean spicy, it meant 3 chances to guess what meat was in it before you gave up. You take another sip from your tin cup, hoping it's just watered-down whiskey and not one of those experimental bean brews that made the rounds during hard times. One particularly infamous saloon in Deadwood had a rotating chili that locals called graveyard stew because the meat was often left undescribed and the flavor hinted at something that had died twice. But you still ate it because hunger didn't care about your dignity. Another odd tradition. The bean dance. No, it wasn't an actual dance, though you might do a little jig after eating too many. This was a term used by cattle hands to describe the cook's routine when trying to spice up beans just enough to make them seem new. One day it's molasses, next day dried apples, then bacon fat, followed by leftover coffee grounds. Yes, coffee grounds. It was frontier fusion cuisine at its most chaotic. And while it might sound absurd, the monotony of the trail meant any variation, however bizarre, was welcome. Beans also became currency in a way. If a cook liked you got the pot scrape bottom where all the good stuff settled. Upset the cook, you'd get the top layer, bland, undercooked, and suspiciously crunchy. That pot became the great social equalizer. No matter how tough or charming you were, you bowed to the bean. There's a kind of reverence in that. You had saloons that named themselves after beans, the Pinto Palace, the Iron Bean, Billy's Bean Bucket, and don't laugh. Those places stayed in business longer than some banks, maybe because beans didn't inflate, crash, or dry up in a drought. They were eternal, and they paired with almost anything. Cornbread, hardtack, boiled roots, or the occasional sliver of smoked beef if someone got lucky in a trade. As your eyes scan the tables around you, you notice every plate features some shade of bean, brown, black, or that unmistakable green-grey that suggests it's been reheated a few too many times. There's no escaping it. Not here, not in the Wild West. And honestly, you're okay with that. There's comfort in the ritual. A spoonful of beans, a sip of something warm, the creak of the saloon ceiling fan spinning just slow enough to hypnotize. It becomes a rhythm, a kind of sleepy gospel of survival and simplicity. You smile, remembering the joke you overheard earlier. Beans are like the West, plain, dusty, and full of surprises. You raise your cup, clink it softly against the wood, and offer a silent toast to the unsung hero of frontier cuisine. Beans didn't need glamour, they just needed to show up, and they always did. You lean back, belly groaning slightly from yet another heaping spoonful of beans, and turn your gaze to the saloon's modest bar, where a shelf of dusty bottles lines the back wall like a makeshift apothecary of poor decisions. But tonight, your interest isn't in the bottom shelf whiskey or that mysterious brown jug labelled snakebite remedy. No, tonight your curiosity drifts toward another staple that filled more bellies than any bourbon ever did. Bread. And not just any bread. This is frontier bread, the kind that doesn't rise with pride, but slumps with resignation. Your first bite of hardtack earlier today nearly chipped your tooth. The second only confirmed what the first had warned. This was not food made for enjoyment, but for survival. Frontier bread came in all forms, but none of them fluffy. Hardtack, Johnny cakes, soda biscuits, fry bread, each a carb-loaded compromise between convenience and edibility. Let's start with the infamous hardtack. It's not a cracker, it's not a biscuit, it's an edible roofing tile. Flour, water, maybe salt. Baked until it could withstand a civil war and still be packed for a cattle drive. That's your historical fact. Hardtack was the primary bread substitute carried by pioneers, soldiers, and cowboys because it could last for months, sometimes years, without spoiling. But it had a price. You had to soften it in coffee, stew, or whiskey, just to gnaw through it, and even then you risked dental regret. Some folks even smashed it with the butt of a revolver before eating. Romantic, no, but practical. Fry bread, on the other hand, was a gift born of hardship. When native tribes were forced onto reservations with limited rations, mostly flour, lard, salt, they turned necessity into invention. Fry bread emerged as a hearty, pan-fried disc of resilience, and as settlers mingled with tribes and learned their techniques, fry bread found its way into many a saloon kitchen, where it was served with beans, honey, or greasy cuts of meat. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some cowboys made air bread. Not because it was light and fluffy, oh no, but because it involved blowing air through a hollow reed into a dough mixture to fluff it up. Did it work? Not really. But it gave the illusion of leavening and something to do while the stew bubbled. And then there was cowboy sourdough, kept alive not by yeast packets, but by someone's grandfather's starter, passed down in a crock and lovingly fed with flour and hope. Every cowboy crew had one guy, usually called Biscuit Joe or Sourdough Pete, whose job it was to nurture the gooey blob like a newborn. It lived by the fire, it got more attention than some horses, and it was considered bad luck to let it die. Historians still argue whether the prominence of sourdough on the frontier was due to practical preservation methods, or simply because cowboys didn't trust store-bought yeast. Either way, sourdough became legend. Saloon kitchens would bake it into rough, dense loaves, sometimes flavoured with wild herbs or leftover bacon fat, sometimes just straight-up tangy bread bricks. You pick at a chunk now, its crust as solid as a saddle horn, but the inside surprisingly soft and fragrant. A rare win in this breadscape. And don't forget Johnny cakes, cornmeal flatbreads cooked on a skillet or stone, cheap, quick, and mercifully chewable. These were popular among both settlers and African-American cooks, who brought variations of them from the southern US. Johnny cakes could be sweet or savoury, depending on what you had. Molasses, beans, or dried berries. Occasionally, if someone was feeling fancy, you'd get a sprinkle of cinnamon. The frontier's version of dessert. You take a bite of one now, still warm, slightly gritty, and think, not bad, could use butter. But in the West, butter was a treasure. Saloon cooks sometimes made it by shaking cream in a jar for hours, using body heat and elbow grease. If they had cows, they might churn it with a makeshift dasher. If they didn't, well, you got lard or nothing. Now here's something even stranger. During desperate winters, some barkeeps served bread soup. The recipe? Crumbled hardtack, warm water, and a dash of salt. That's it. Not even beans. One gambler in Nevada once demanded a refund after being served it, to which the barkeep replied, "The water's warm, ain't it?" You chuckle, imagining that poor soul, spooning in hope and swallowing disappointment. There were innovations too. Some cooks added soda or ash to quicken the baking process. Some mixed in chopped jerky or dried vegetables for a kind of meatloaf bread hybrid that usually ended up tasting like damp firewood. But when it worked, it worked. And there were those legendary nights, rare as snowfall in summer, when a passing traveller had yeast, or a peddler traded sugar, and a saloon actually served cake. Yes, cake. Dry, dense, slightly metallic tasting cake, but cake nonetheless. A birthday might be invented just to justify it, and the person with the first slice treated like royalty, because out here, anything that rose in the oven was practically a miracle. You lean your elbows on the table, watching a couple of miners argue over the last biscuit, and you smile. There's something honest about this bread. It doesn't pretend to be anything fancy. It doesn't crumble at the first sign of pressure. It sits there, solid, unspectacular, but necessary. Like the West itself. A reminder that sometimes the plainest things carry the most weight. So you tear off another piece, chew slowly, and feel just a little closer to understanding why everyone keeps coming back to this creaky old saloon in the middle of nowhere. You settle into the worn wooden stool again, the scent of pine smoke and stale whiskey lingering in the air, your thoughts turning to the Wild West's unexpected culinary oddities, specifically those curious beverages that accompanied the grub, or in some cases, tried desperately to pass as drinks. You probably expect saloon drinks to be nothing but bottom-shelf whiskey or gritty beer, but the truth is a little weirder, and frankly, more desperate. Let's start with sarsaparilla, the so-called king of drinks in these parts. A root, beer precursor brewed from wild roots, herbs, and sometimes a splash of actual sassafras. Historically, sarsaparilla was believed to have medicinal properties, thought to purify blood and cure all sorts of ailments from rheumatism to snake bites, though historians still argue whether its actual benefits were placebo or genuine. The flavor is earthy and sweet, a little like a forest floor that somehow also tastes like candy. It was the drink of choice for cowboys who wanted something non-alcoholic or who couldn't stomach the bite of whiskey at sunrise. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some barkeeps spike their sarsaparilla with alcohol, sometimes bootlegged hooch, sometimes cheap brandy, giving it a dangerous kick that unsuspecting drunks called the sarsaparilla surprise. You'd smile to see a newcomer's face go from wholesome refreshment to sudden regret in one sip. Then there's the infamous prairie oyster, a hangover cure as colourful as its name suggests. It's basically a raw egg, Worcestershire sauce, black pepper and vinegar served in a shot glass and chased with whiskey. The idea was to shock the system awake, but historians still debate whether this concoction actually worked or was simply a cruel prank passed down from one hungover cowboy to the next. You're not eager to try it, but the mere thought paints a vivid picture of frontier mornings, more desperation than dignity. Beer was popular too, but don't imagine frothy pints from shiny taps. The frontier version was often warm, flat, and brewed locally in small batches that tasted somewhere between sour and, "Why did I drink this?" Some brewers experimented with unusual ingredients like prairie flowers or juniper berries, resulting in brews that would make modern craft beer enthusiasts both jealous and slightly horrified. Then came whiskey smash, a mixed drink involving whiskey, crushed ice, and any sweetener or citrus on hand, usually lemons stolen from the nearest traveling grocer. It was a favorite at poker tables, where its numbing effect helped mask the sting of losses and dubious deals. Now for the fringe. Frontier bartenders sometimes served worm whiskey, literally whiskey infused with a live grub or worm, supposedly to add flavor and potency. This oddity was more popular in the Southwest and is believed to have originated from Mexican mezcal traditions, but some daring cowpokes insisted on it, claiming it added the bite of the desert. Of course, historians argue whether worm whiskey was widespread or mostly a myth spread by tall tales. Another local favorite was coffee tonic, which might sound trendy today, but was just boiled coffee, mixed with tonic water and a dash of molasses or sugar, served cold when summer hit the plains. The caffeine and quinine combo promised a wake-up call stronger than any morning prayer. Oddly enough, this drink faded into obscurity after the 19th century, but has seen a tiny revival in some niche craft bars. And you can't ignore sour mash, a whiskey made from fermented mash left over from a previous batch, giving it a sour tang and harsher bite than smoother varieties. Distilleries often reuse the mash to save resources, but this practice created spirited debates on quality, with some aficionados preferring the sour mash's bold character and others decrying it as rough frontier fuel. You catch a miner eyeing his glass suspiciously, and remember that despite all the rough edges, drinks here were more than mere beverages. They were part of the social glue holding these rough communities together. Whether it was a shot of whiskey, shared in solidarity, or a communal jug of coffee tonic passed around the campfire, these drinks told stories of endurance, ingenuity, and just plain stubbornness. You imagine yourself in the thick of a saloon brawl, or huddled around a fire during a blizzard, and it's those drinks that kept spirits afloat. You're tempted to try the prairie oyster after all, just for the story you'd tell tomorrow, though your stomach protests. The saloon's floor creaks underfoot, and the laughter and rowdiness swirl around you as you take another sip of your own, carefully chosen and decidedly less ambitious. It's clear that in the Wild West, survival wasn't just about what you ate, but what you drank, and the frontier's odd concoctions are a testament to human creativity when the pantry was bare and the nights were long. You push your chair back and step outside the saloon, where the dry wind rustles the prairie grass, carrying whispers of stories long forgotten but never quite gone. The day's heat still lingers on the cracked dirt streets, baking the wood, and leather of the town's buildings. And as you walk, your mind drifts to the meals that fueled these frontier lives. Not just the drinks, but the solid, sometimes questionable, sometimes surprisingly hearty food that kept cowboys, miners, and settlers going. You probably imagine juicy steaks grilled over open flames, but the reality was often less glamorous and a lot tougher to chew. Beef was king, sure, but it was usually tough, overcooked, and salted heavily to last the long haul, often served as jerky or preserved in barrels. Fresh produce was a rare luxury, shipped in from faraway places or grown in small gardens that struggled against the harsh environment. One mainstream fact is that beans and hardtack, those dense, cracker-like biscuits, were staples, providing calories and a semblance of variety. Beans, slow-cooked with salted pork or bacon, created a humble but filling stew that echoed from campfires to dining tables, a meal both practical and oddly comforting. Yet, here's a quirky bit. Some cowboys were rumored to carry cactus, candy, bits of prickly pear cactus preserved in sugar or syrup, a sweet treat born from necessity and the surprising generosity of the desert. Historians still argue whether cactus candy was widely enjoyed or just a niche survival snack among the most adventurous. And you can't overlook the infamous mock turtle soup, a cheap imitation of the British delicacy made by boiling calf's head and mixing in whatever vegetables were on hand. It was the height of frontier haute cuisine for a while, proving that even in the roughest places, people craved sophistication, if only in imitation. Then there's the wild game, which added flavor and variety when the luck was on your side. Venison, rabbit, and even prairie chickens were hunted, though their availability was seasonal and often erratic. You might find a miner sharing a freshly skinned jackrabbit stew, but it was a gamble whether the meat was tender or tough enough to challenge your jaw's endurance. Interestingly, some settlers experimented with frying rattlesnake, claiming it tasted like chicken, but with more bite. Though historians debate how often rattlesnake actually made it to the dinner table versus being an exaggerated frontier myth. The staple bread of the era was often slapjacks, a kind of fried batter pancake cooked over campfires, sometimes sweetened with molasses or honey when available. It was quick to prepare and provided a comforting carb fix in a landscape otherwise dominated by tough meats and dried beans. Then there was the campfire coffee, made by tossing grounds directly into boiling water, resulting in a gritty, bitter brew that somehow kept everyone awake for the next long day. Fringe tidbit alert. Some frontier cooks added a pinch of gunpowder to coffee for an extra kick, though the efficacy and safety of this practice are subjects of ongoing scholarly debate. You imagine yourself at a communal table, sharing a meal that might look meager by today's standards, but held stories of resilience and camaraderie. The dishes weren't just about nourishment, they were a symbol of the harshness and resourcefulness that defined life on the edge of civilization. Occasionally, you'd spot a rare luxury, perhaps a pie made from preserved apples or cherries, a sweet nod to the comforts left behind. These treats were often made from canned or dried fruits and celebrated with quiet joy after a long day's toil. It's easy to romanticize the frontier feast, but the truth is often gritty, practical, and tinged with a hint of desperation, because the people eating those meals were more concerned with survival than taste, but still, they found ways to inject flavor, variety, and a little fun into their diets, whether through experimental recipes or clever substitutions. You feel the warmth of that shared human spirit as you imagine passing around a tin cup of stew beneath the stars, the crackling fire providing more comfort than the food itself. The Wild West food story isn't just about what ended up on the plate, but what it reveals about the people who lived through hardship, community, and the relentless pursuit of a better life. You take a slow breath, the dust swirling gently around, your boots, and for a moment, you're part of that history, messy, tough, but utterly alive. You step back inside the dim saloon, the smell of sawdust and stale whiskey mingling with the faint aroma of smoke and frying grease, and your mind shifts from the food itself to the drinking culture that shaped so many of these frontier establishments. Saloons were more than just watering holes. They were social hubs, places where deals were struck, stories swapped, and rivalries ignited, often over a pint or two. The standard drink was whiskey, a fiery spirit distilled from corn or rye, which could be bought by the shot or by the bottle if you were feeling flush. One mainstream fact is that whiskey was often adulterated with additives like tobacco juice, or even embalming fluid to stretch supplies or pack a stronger punch, a practice that sometimes turned innocent sippers into instant regretters. Quirky tidbit. Some saloon owners mixed their own cocktails by blending whiskey with unusual ingredients like raw eggs or molasses, creating concoctions that modern palates would likely find baffling or borderline hazardous. Historians still argue whether these mixes were common or confined to eccentric characters trying to differentiate their bar's offerings. You can imagine the clink of glasses and the murmur of low conversations, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter or the sharp crack of a card table dispute. Beer, though less common than whiskey, was prized when available, typically unfiltered and heavy, often served in thick glass mugs that could double as weapons if necessary. The brewing methods were crude but effective, and some frontier towns boasted small breweries run by recent immigrants trying to bring a taste of home to the wild frontier. Interestingly, sarsaparilla was a popular non-alcoholic choice, a root beer-like drink with a sweet, slightly medicinal flavor, often served to temper the harshness of the environment or the stronger drinks. It was also touted as a health tonic, though whether it actually cured anything remains up for debate. You picture the bartenders, sometimes rowdy, sometimes charming, who could pour a drink, break up a brawl, and dole out advice all at once, their deft hands moving behind the counter with practiced ease. They knew the value of a good drink to calm nerves or loosen tongues, but they also understood the thin line between fun and trouble. The tradition of ladies' nights, or women being allowed in certain saloons, was a complex and often contradictory one. Sometimes women ran the bars or performed as singers and dancers. Other times they were outright banned, depending on the town's culture and laws. Fringe tidbit. Some saloons featured the longest bar in the West, a claim that was more about marketing than reality, yet these legends added to the mystique of frontier nightlife. The scent of roasted coffee beans occasionally wafted from a corner, a reminder that not everyone was chasing the next shot of whiskey. Some sought comfort in a bitter cup of joe, which helped them face the early morning after a late night. Remember that gritty campfire coffee from earlier. The saloon brew was a bit more refined, but still nowhere near the specialty coffees we're used to today. Historians still argue whether the rough reputation of saloon drinks was justified, or whether many were simply victims of their own tough lives and hard liquor. The drinks weren't just about inebriation. They were about ritual, connection, and momentary escape from the relentless challenges of frontier existence. You might overhear a traveling salesman bragging about his goods, a gambler nervously eyeing his chips, or a weary miner counting the hours until payday, all united by the common thread of raising a glass to survive. And then there's the infamous painted ladies, women who worked in the saloons not just serving drinks but also offering companionship and more. Their presence a subject of endless speculation and moral debate both then and now. These women often lived precarious lives, caught between societal scorn and economic necessity, and their stories add a poignant layer to the saloon's rough and tumble facade. The saloon was a microcosm of the Wild West itself. Rough, sometimes crude, but pulsing with life and complexity. You almost hear the piano playing in the background, the notes weaving through the laughter and the clatter of poker chips, as the Mai night deepens and the stories grow taller. So, as you sit back in that creaky wooden chair, sipping a drink that might burn your throat but warms your soul, you realize that the food and drink of the West tell a story far bigger than mere survival. They tell a story of human connection, of resilience, and of the small comforts that made an unforgiving landscape feel a little more like home. You push through the saloon's swinging doors once more, the air thick with smoke and laughter, but your mind drifts toward the harsh realities behind those raucous nights. how the food and drink you just imagined were often luxuries that many in the Wild West simply could not afford. Life on the frontier was brutal, and for the average worker, whether a miner, ranch hand, or railroad laborer, meals were sparse and monotonous. One mainstream historical fact is that salt pork and beans were staples for most working class folks. These preserved foods were cheap, calorie-dense, and could last for months, though their flavor left much to be desired. Salt pork, in particular, was notoriously fatty and salty, requiring soaking and boiling to make it edible, which sounds about as appetizing as it feels when you first hear it. A quirky tidbit is that some frontier families would boil and reuse the same batch of beans over and over, believing it was a good way to stretch their meager supplies, though modern taste buds might find the idea a little unsettling. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or just a necessity, born from desperation in the toughest seasons. Imagine yourself at a campfire after a grueling day, staring into the flickering flames as the night air grows cold, a pot of boiling beans and pork hanging over the fire, the aroma barely masking the damp earth and sweat-soaked clothes you wear. The monotony of frontier fare was broken occasionally by wild game, if you were lucky, a rabbit, deer, or even a squirrel, which was sometimes jokingly referred to as prairie chicken by settlers trying to make it sound more appealing. Hunting was a vital skill, but it was no guarantee of a hearty meal, especially in harsh winters or drought years. Another quirky detail is that settlers sometimes ate insects, such as grasshoppers or crickets, as a protein source when all else failed, a fact that might make you cringe but also shows the raw reality of survival. Some Native American tribes introduced settlers to edible plants and cooking techniques that softened this harsh diet, but cultural barriers often limited these exchanges. Historians still argue whether these culinary influences significantly impacted the settler diet or remained marginal. You can almost feel the cold bite of the wind as you chew on a dry biscuit or hardtack. The staple bread of the era, an unyielding slab of baked flour that was as close to cardboard as food gets, yet somehow still beloved for its practicality. Hardtack was prized for its long shelf life, but infamous for causing dental problems, earning nicknames like tooth dullers or jawbreakers. These biscuits might have been dunked in coffee or soup to soften them, though that only partially improved the experience. The simplicity of these foods was necessary. Refrigeration was non-existent, and fresh ingredients spoiled quickly on the trail or at isolated homesteads. Salt was king, not just for flavor but for preserving whatever meat could be hunted or butchered. You might also picture cast iron skillets over campfires, their blackened surfaces a badge of rugged outdoor cooking, where everything from potatoes to beans simmered slowly. One fringe tidbit is that some settlers experimented with mock desserts using whatever sweeteners they could find, like molasses or wild berries, creating crude pies or cakes that were more about novelty than culinary delight. The stories you hear around these frontier tables often emphasize practicality over pleasure, but there was a surprising resilience and creativity in making do with what little was available. The daily grind of preparing food could take hours, especially for women and children, who often bore the brunt of cooking and preserving for the family. Water was another scarce resource, and boiling it for cooking was both a necessity and a burden, especially in areas with contaminated sources. Historians still argue whether the nutritional deficiencies common in these diets contributed more to frontier mortality than the famously harsh environmental conditions. As you sit back in your imagined camp chair, you start to appreciate the small miracles of flavor and warmth that those early settlers treasured, whether it was a scoop of fresh milk or a rare piece of cornbread. Small luxuries that momentarily lifted spirits amid hardship. The tough life meant meals were often eaten quickly and without ceremony, but the stories shared over the fire and the simple act of breaking bread together created bonds that defined these frontier communities. You might recall earlier mentions of the saloon's more indulgent offerings, but here, in the humble homes and camps, food was a daily test of endurance and ingenuity. Even though the diet was often dull and repetitive, it fueled the relentless push westward. the dreams of land, ownership, freedom, or simply surviving another day. And sometimes, just sometimes, a fresh catch or a friendly neighbor's gift could turn an otherwise bleak meal into a cause for celebration, a brief respite from the unforgiving wilderness. The frontier diet was harsh, yes, but it was also a testament to human adaptability and hope in the face of relentless challenge. You step back through the saloon's creaky doors, leaving behind the dust and dirt of the street for a moment to focus on a lesser-known but fascinating part of Wild West dining: the role of women behind the scenes and their impact on saloon, fare, and frontier cooking. While the saloon's rowdy atmosphere might suggest a man's world, women's contributions, though often hidden, were essential to sustaining these rough-and-tumble communities. One mainstream historical fact is that many saloons were run or co-managed by women, often called saloon madams, who controlled both the business and the kitchen. These women faced constant social judgment, balancing entrepreneurship with survival in a world that afforded them few rights. The kitchen was often their domain, where the limited ingredients available were stretched into meals that catered to tough customers with big appetites. A quirky tidbit is that some madams used the kitchen to double as a social hub, serving meals not just to patrons but also to families and traveling workers, blurring the line between saloon and communal dining hall. This informal role helped build fragile social networks in otherwise transient frontier towns. Historians still argue whether the influence of these women extended beyond economic necessity to shape the culinary culture of the West, or if their contributions have simply been overlooked in favor of more sensational saloon tales. You can almost see a woman moving between pots and pans, expertly chopping whatever vegetables could be found, often preserved or dried, with an eye on the sizzling skillet where salted beef or wild game cooks. Behind the scenes, women managed impossible logistics, stocking supplies, preparing food, and navigating the rough clientele, all while carving out a space for themselves in a largely male-dominated society. The smell of frying bacon mingled with the smoke of the fireplace, as meals were prepared quickly to satisfy hungry miners and cowboys. Frontier cooking required creativity, especially when fresh ingredients were scarce. Some women used pickled or smoked foods extensively, techniques learned from Native Americans or immigrants. Another quirky tidbit is that women occasionally made medicinal concoctions, combining cooking with early herbal remedies, which might have helped ease hangovers or minor ailments, primitive versions of the morning after cure. These remedies might include teas made from local herbs or concoctions with questionable taste but earnest intent. Historians still argue how much of this traditional knowledge was passed down through informal female networks or lost amidst the harsh conditions of frontier life. Imagine the balancing act of managing a kitchen in a saloon while dealing with boisterous customers and the ever-present threat of violence. Women in these roles needed resilience and a sharp wit, qualities often hidden behind their quieter work. The stories of these women, often untold or relegated to footnotes, remind us that the Wild West was more than just gunfights and saloon brawls. It was a complex society where food and hospitality played subtle but vital roles. These women sometimes created makeshift menus that combined simple staples with occasional luxuries like freshly baked bread or sweet treats, which, though rare, were deeply appreciated by patrons. The kitchen's heat was intense, with open flames and hot irons, and food safety was rudimentary at best, contributing to the infamous bouts of food poisoning that plagued many frontier towns. Yet these women persevered, their kitchens acting as lifelines for weary travelers and workers. You might recall earlier sections discussing the rough nature of frontier food. This glimpse behind the scenes adds depth to the story, highlighting the human element and the effort it took to feed a community in such unforgiving conditions. Their legacy is a quiet one, seen in the gradual evolution of Western American cuisine and the subtle infusion of diverse culinary influences brought by immigrants and indigenous peoples. From the battered cast iron pots to the preserved herbs, hanging in small bundles, their kitchens were places of survival, culture, and occasionally comfort. The resilience and ingenuity of these women shaped the taste of the West in ways historians still debate. But their impact on daily life is undeniable. As you imagine the flickering candlelight in a dusty kitchen corner, the clatter of utensils, and the murmur of whispered conversations, you realize that these moments of domestic life were as foundational to the frontier's story as any gunfight or gold rush. Behind every hearty meal served at a saloon, there was a story of hard work, sacrifice, and a stubborn refusal to let hunger and hardship define the day. This perspective enriches your understanding of the West, reminding you that, even in the roughest places, food was a powerful force for community and survival. You find yourself walking back into the smoky haze of a Wild West saloon, but this time, your senses sharpen to the curious and often overlooked world of drinks and beverages, because no saloon meal was complete without a proper drink, or several. The mainstream historical fact you should keep in mind is that whiskey reigned supreme in the West, often homemade or poorly aged, serving as both a social lubricant and a harsh reality check for many frontier folks. But beyond whiskey, a surprising variety of other drinks filled the bottles and barrels behind the bar, some more wholesome than others. A quirky tidbit is that sarsaparilla, a sweet and slightly medicinal soda-like beverage, was wildly popular, often touted as a cure-all for ailments and sometimes confused by modern folks as root beer's older, tougher cousin. This drink's popularity reveals an interesting side to frontier saloons. They weren't just for the hard-drinking cowboy crowd, but also attracted families and travelers seeking a milder alternative to straight liquor. Historians still argue whether sarsaparilla's health claims had any merit or were mostly clever marketing by suppliers eager to sell their wares. You can picture the bartender, a grizzled figure with a quick smile and a faster hand, pouring whiskey shots, topping up tankards of beer, and mixing sarsaparilla for the few patrons who preferred something less fiery. Beer, often brewed locally or imported from the East Coast, was another staple, though its quality varied widely, sometimes watered down, sometimes so strong it could knock you off your feet faster than a bullet. Another quirky tidbit is the existence of firewater, an ominous nickname for particularly potent, sometimes homemade whiskey that could cause a hangover lasting days, or worse, liver trouble. The danger and allure of firewater was part of the saloon's mythos, contributing to countless tall tales and cautionary stories whispered around campfires. Historians still debate the extent to which alcohol consumption in the West was a symptom of hardship or a cultural staple shaping frontier life. The saloon's drink menu also occasionally included coffee, brewed strong and black, often the only other beverage available to keep miners and cowboys awake through long nights. Despite the rough conditions, some saloons tried to serve what they called coffeehouse coffee, an attempt at sophistication in an otherwise rugged setting. You might recall the smoky atmosphere from earlier sections, now mixed with the bitter scent of coffee and the sharp tang of whiskey, creating a sensory cocktail unique to this environment. Interestingly, the water used in drinks was often suspect, leading to the use of alcohol as a safer alternative, a strange but practical fact of life on the frontier. You can almost hear the clang of tin cups and the murmur of conversation as deals were struck, stories swapped, and friendships forged over drinks, highlighting the saloon's role as a social hub. The bartenders sometimes doubled as informal counselors or news sources, with local gossip flowing as freely as the liquor. The role of women in the saloon's drink culture also deserves mention. Some women were skilled bartenders or barkeepers, breaking stereotypes and carving out a niche in this male-dominated world. A quirky tidbit is that some female bartenders developed signature cocktails, though recipes were rudimentary, and mostly centered on masking the roughness of available spirits. Historians still argue how much these women influenced drinking culture, or if their contributions have been overshadowed by more notorious figures. The mixing of drinks often involved simple syrups, herbs, or bitters to improve taste, showing early experimentation that foreshadowed modern cocktail culture. As you absorb this, it's clear that drinking in the Wild West was about more than just drowning sorrows. It was a complex ritual intertwined with survival, social bonding, and even subtle forms of rebellion against harsh realities. Remember, the earlier sections on food scarcity and rough cooking. Drinks often compensated for what the meals lacked, providing warmth, comfort, or distraction. Imagining the flickering lamplight reflecting off dusty bottles and the laughter echoing through the room, you get a fuller picture of the saloon's atmosphere, a place where drinks were a gateway to stories, dreams, and sometimes trouble. You might smile thinking about how many times those simple drinks fueled legendary tales, brawls, and unexpected friendships, underscoring the saloon's dual role as both sanctuary and stage for the Wild West drama. It's a reminder that every sip taken in those dusty, crowded rooms was a thread woven into the vast tapestry of frontier life, rich with complexity, hardship, and a surprising amount of flavor. You step deeper into the story of the Wild West Saloon's food and drink scene, this time focusing on the strange and often surprising role of sweets and desserts, or rather the near absence of them, in these rough-and-tumble establishments. The mainstream historical fact here is that sugar was expensive and relatively scarce on the frontier, making sweets a rare luxury rather than a staple. Many saloons didn't even bother offering desserts because the clientele was mostly working, men looking for hearty meals or quick drinks, not delicate pastries. However, a quirky tidbit is that some saloons and boarding houses tried to improvise with what they had, using molasses, dried fruits, and sometimes even acorns or pine nuts to create primitive forms of sweets or snacks. You can imagine how pine nut brittle or molasses-soaked biscuits might have tasted, a far cry from the sugary desserts we take for granted today. Historians still argue whether the scarcity of sweets was a reflection of true economic hardship, or simply a cultural preference shaped by necessity and available resources. As you picture yourself in that smoky, lively saloon, you might catch the faint aroma of burnt sugar or molasses, evidence of the crude sweet treats being prepared behind the bar or in the kitchen. These improvised sweets were often designed to give a quick energy boost rather than satisfy any refined craving for sugar. You might recall from earlier sections the rough bread and tough meats. Desserts were hardly a priority when just getting enough calories to survive was the main goal. Another quirky tidbit is the use of hardtack or dried biscuits, which could be soaked in coffee or whiskey to soften them, sometimes sweetened with molasses or honey if available, creating a primitive form of dessert or snack that frontier folk made do with. Historians still debate whether these snacks were more about practicality or if they actually held sentimental value as comfort foods in harsh times. You can almost feel the dryness of hardtack and the effort it took to chew, making you appreciate the small moments of sweetness even more. Interestingly, some saloons would stock candy, hard candies or lozenges brought in by traveling salesmen or peddlers, which served multiple purposes, including soothing sore throats, freshening breath, or simply offering a quick sugary treat for those who could afford it. The presence of candy highlights the strange juxtaposition of luxury and hardship coexisting in frontier life. You might chuckle imagining cowboys sucking on hard candies between rounds of whiskey, a curious mix of toughness and childlike comfort. Women and children, when present in the saloon or nearby boarding houses, were the most likely recipients of such sweets, showing a subtle but important social dynamic in these male-dominated spaces. A quirky tidbit is that some saloons doubled as informal candy shops during the day, attracting families and travelers, a softer side of the wild frontier rarely depicted in popular culture. Historians still argue whether these daytime roles for saloons significantly softened their rough reputations or were just a temporary survival tactic. The scarcity and improvisation around sweets tell a broader story about how food culture on the frontier adapted to limitations, creating a cuisine defined by necessity but punctuated with small joys. You might remember the earlier mentions of molasses and acorns as staples for improvised sweets, and how resourcefulness was a daily requirement for survival. As you imagine yourself savoring a rare, sticky molasses biscuit or a piece of hardened candy, you get a glimpse into the small pleasures that made the brutal reality just a little more bearable. The story of sweets in the Wild West Saloon is one of contrasts. Scarcity and improvisation, toughness and tenderness, rough conditions and fleeting delights, all woven together into the fabric of frontier life. It's a reminder that even in the harshest places, people found ways to bring a bit of sweetness into their world, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically, and that those small moments often carried outsized importance in the daily grind of survival. You step now into the murky world of food safety, or rather, the complete lack of it, in Wild West saloons, where dining could be as dangerous as a shootout if you weren't careful or simply unlucky. The mainstream historical fact here is that the American West in the late 19th century had little to no food regulation, which meant saloon kitchens operated under conditions that would make any modern health inspector pass out. Refrigeration was rare and unreliable, if present at all, so meat was often salted or smoked, and even then, it could still go bad in the blink of an eye. Milk and butter turned sour almost immediately in the summer heat, and canned goods, which were increasing in popularity, were a gamble. Bulging tins could explode with the pungent scent of botulism. Historians still argue whether the most common foodborne illnesses in frontier towns were simply dismissed as bad digestion or swamp belly, vague terms that masked the truly dangerous conditions diners often faced. A quirky tidbit is that many saloons made liberal use of heavy spices like cayenne, mustard seed, and vinegar, not for flavor, but to disguise the smell and taste of meat that was already well on its way to becoming a science experiment. You might find yourself lifting a fork of heavily peppered stew, the sting of the spice distracting you from the greyish hue of the meat underneath, probably beef, or maybe something else entirely. Another reality is that rat infestations were nearly impossible to prevent, and it wasn't uncommon to hear the scurrying of little claws behind the bar, or even see a tail flick across the floor mid-meal. Some kitchens attempted to hang food from rafters in sacks or netting to keep rodents out, but rats were clever and tenacious, and many succeeded in finding their way into the stores anyway. You can almost hear the soft thunk of a rat trap going, off in a corner while the saloon piano plays on, oblivious. Historians still debate whether these unsanitary conditions were simply tolerated because they were inescapable, or if people genuinely believed that strong drink and spicy food could somehow ward off disease. Spoiler, they couldn't. Another common tactic was boiling. Soups and stews were staples in saloons because boiling the ingredients killed off some bacteria, and it also allowed cooks to use scraps, bones, and dubious cuts of meat without much scrutiny. A pot of stew could sit on a fire for days, with new ingredients thrown in daily, a sort of never-ending cauldron of mystery. You'd ladle out a portion, unsure if what floated to the top was beef, chicken, or raccoon, and frankly, you might not want to know. A quirky little reality was the use of questionable fats and oils. Rendered animal fat was reused endlessly for frying or baking, often until it was dark brown and carried the flavor of everything it had ever cooked. Fry bread or flapjacks made with this oil had a unique tang that could only be described as frontier flavor. You might wrinkle your nose at the strange aftertaste, but in a place where everything was scarce, wasting oil was unthinkable. Clean water was another problem entirely. Many frontier towns relied on shallow wells, creeks, or even rain barrels, which were easily contaminated. A quirky workaround? Drinking beer, coffee, or tea exclusively. Even children were given small beer, a weak brew with just enough alcohol to kill off germs. You sip your lukewarm tin mug of coffee and realize it's not just for the caffeine, it's your best hope at staying healthy. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of alcohol in the diet was cultural, medicinal, or a desperate response to bad water, and the truth is probably all three. Food poisoning was so common it was almost unremarkable. Aches, vomiting, and fevers were part of daily life, with no real understanding of what caused them. The worst offenders were shellfish or improperly canned meats, which could kill in hours. And yet, people kept eating because there wasn't much choice. The modern notion of expiration dates, safety seals, and refrigeration would have been laughable to the cowboy eating a pickle that had spent months floating in a questionable brine barrel. Even the plates and utensils could be suspect. Washed quickly in dirty water, wiped with a reused cloth, and handed off to the next patron. You might pause before digging into your beans, spotting a smudge of something unidentifiable on your spoon, but with hunger gnawing at your belly, you'd shrug and dig in anyway. The story of food safety, or the wild improvisation that stood in for it, in the Wild West Saloon is a lesson in grit, risk, and the strange resilience of the human stomach. Through spoiled stews, suspicious meat, and rodent-plagued kitchens, people endured, adapted, and developed iron guts along the way. And you, dear listener, would have done the same, because when the sun set behind the hills and the saloon doors swung open, a hot plate of something, anything, was often the only thing standing between you and another night of hard, hungry sleep.